In the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Amon Sûl, they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring, like a rough crown on the old hill's head. Yet once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west, in the days of the last alliance. I'm Father Andrew Stephen Damick, and you're listening to the Amon Sûl podcast. My Govanen, welcome to Amon Sûl, a podcast for tall hobbits with elvish aspirations. I'm Father Andrew, an Orthodox Christian priest, and here we talk about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien because we love them and believe in their power to orient us toward what is highest and noblest. Today I'm hosting Amon Sûl for the last time, as Richard,
maybe the last time.
Richard, whoever you are, Richard, Rohlin, and I hand off the baton to Father Anthony Cook. And so for this is not the first time, actually. We've had three people on before, although it's not happened a bunch of times. It's been maybe just once or twice. So welcome to this special episode. This is Richard and my last episode as the hosts of this show, and it's Father Anthony's first. So we're overlapping, we're transitioning. I don't know. I'm kind of tearing up over here, you guys. I'm feeling a little sentimental. Also, I should point out that for those of you who are watching on YouTube, this is the very first Amon Sûl episode on YouTube.
We do have faces.
Yes, we have. different author, Richard. Different author.
Yeah. Oh, right. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have faces, and part of the transition for this for Amon Sûl is now it's going to reside on YouTube as well. Of course, the audio podcast will continue, but for those who want to watch it, that will now be a thing. So, here we are.
I want you to think of this not as the end of our time on the podcast, but it's more like the breaking of the fellowship, the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. And Father Anthony is going to continue the quest for us to carry the ring to Mordor, while Father Andrew and I go off and do like a little side quest, where one of us becomes, King of Gondor, essentially. I think that's...
Who will it be?
Seems like you.
I don't know.
It's like you. Yeah. No, so we're going to be doing the Great Tales podcast, and I think that's going to be really great and a lot of fun and very complimentary. I really just think of it as the continuation, actually, of what we started on Amon Sûl, in the same way that Tolkien was for me the introduction, really, or one of the introductions to what we sometimes call the great tradition, right?
Yeah.
Just this whole world of stories and myths and legends. And so now we're going to take the things we were doing with Amon Sûl and carry that forward. And in the meantime, Father Anthony is going to do something which neither of us ever had the temerity to do, which is to begin a read through of The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. So this should take what, 6, 7, 8, 10
6 years. Yeah.
Years. I don't know. So in any event, welcome, Father Anthony Cook, to your podcast.
Well, thank you. I have to say I'm a little concerned about your comment about the breaking of the fellowship, Richard. Because, the characters that arrive at the point of the breaking of the fellowship are the Uruk-hai. And what have you asked me as now?
No, it's okay. You're going to lose a finger, but Father Andrew and I, we're going to get kingdoms. So it's just good. It works out for everyone.
I'm still not sure I got that.
Yeah.
Oh,
We've ended so many episodes with their taking the hobbits to Isengard.
That is true.
I feel like we've telegraphed this for a very long time.
That's fair. That's long time foreshadowing. That's or maybe that's a brilliant retcon.
4D chess.
All compliments to you both, because this has been a beautiful journey you've been on. I've enjoyed the glimpses I've had of it, the chances I've come to walk with you a little bit, and I'm sad that now I have to carry on while the two of you go off to have great adventures in the west or wherever you're going. West and east, and I'm guessing a lot in the north. But
yes, very likely. So this is our 111st episode, everybody. Again, a perfect transition number.
I should explain, that's a Tolkien reference.
but it's a spoiler because we're not getting to that chapter yet.
Oh,
So
dang, sorry.
That's
Yeah, yeah,
true. That's
sorry.
true. But
There are
yeah,
no spoilers on 50-year-old books.
yeah. Yeah, so this is our 11th episode. So this is the final episode with Richard and me, and it's the first episode with Father Anthony as the host. Although for those who've been listening since we started in 2019, Father Anthony is no stranger to the podcast by any means. I mean, Father, you were on a very early episode where we talked about the Athrobeth,
Mm.
and you've been on, I think, a couple of times since then as well. So this 5-year voyage, you're not a new shipmate, but you're a new captain. So yeah. But yeah, anyway, so on this 11th episode, we're going to be talking about the prologue to the Lord of the Rings. That passage that everybody skips, I guess, for whatever reason. And it's going to be fun.
Is this the part that's narrated by Kate Blanchett? Is that what this is?
That's right. That's
Okay.
that's right. It's the Kate Blanchett bit.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So yeah, this is going to be what this episode is about. But we thought, anyway. So Father Anthony, I know you had some stuff you wanted to say.
Well, yeah, you've got to start somewhere. A prologue is a good place to start. I'm not saying the very good. Anyway, we don't need to go there. It's a different podcast. But starting with the prologue, we get to discuss a lot about hobbits and migrations of peoples and pipeweed and calendars and frame narratives. And we're not going to see anyone falling in the mud like in the movies, and that's okay.
I just got legitimately excited because pipeweed, frame narratives, migrations of peoples, those are literally my favorite things.
Well, and Tolkien's too, you can tell that.
Yes.
I was listening to an audiobook this morning to refresh my memory and thinking, this is such a weird book. If you pick this up and you open it up and this guy starts talking about, you should know a few things about hobbits and where they've lived and what kind of people they are and, how they migrated. And it's like, okay, this is like the apparatus for a medieval manuscript, which go figure.
Yeah. The most
Anyway.
unlikely of beginnings for the most popular novel of the 20th century.
When I was like 8 and reading this, I was like, this is amazing. How have I never heard about hobbits? Like, I feel like I should know about this. I mean, this is like, obviously there's some real history here. I mean, it has that kind of it's almost, I would say, intentionally dry, where it's kind of like sort of selling this as here's an important anthropological study to introduce you to hobbits and some of their particularities. For instance, why are they smoking, tobacco in basically a medieval setting, which is a New World plant, right?
Sure. Well, It's very complimentary to the reader. It says, I know that you're an intelligent person who is interested in all the right sorts of things, like me. So I will share all of these interesting things with you, and we will all have a wonderful time. It's anyway. Now, so that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get into all of the interesting things, as it were, I'd like to invite the two of you to share some favorite memories from these past 5 years. It's been a beautiful journey, a long journey. I don't think we could do anything like justice to this, but you should have the chance, and I'd love to hear what was your favorite thing.
Wow. There's been a lot of, I think for me, I think about the beginning of when it started in 2019. Initially, by the way, everybody, the plan was to have it start on March 25th, 2019, but it started on February 25th, 2019, because I was so impatient. That's really what it came down to being. It's like, okay, I've got this plan, but I was like, I want to start it now. I want to start it now. And so it started a month earlier. With my very first episode with Steve Christoforo as the first guest,
right?
And I think
at least his voice,
yeah. So the thing that still strikes me about this show is that when I went to the leadership at Ancient Faith Radio with the idea, at the time, most I don't know, most Ancient Faith Radio podcasts consisted of intro music with a voiceover, someone talking for 20, 30, 45, 60 minutes, and then outro music with a voiceover, which is a perfectly acceptable and lovely podcast format, you know. Um, there wasn't it was mostly simply about uh what you might think of as spiritual topics, like official religious churchy stuff. There were some notable exceptions, of course. I think, for instance, of Pop Culture Coffee Hour by, Steve Christoforo and Kristen Gonzalez. But there was not much in the way of two people talking to each other. I mean, I was doing Areopagus with Pastor Mike Lensman at that point as well. We had been doing that for 2 years then, but there was not a more complex structure with like multiple segments and transition music between them, and certainly there wasn't anything that was doing literary criticism, which is what this podcast is. Talking about books, talking about great literature. And the thing that I thought was just so beautiful was when I presented the idea to AFR leadership, their response was, that's different, it's new, but let's try it. Right? They were willing to put their resources into it and say, let's try this thing. And I think that helped to kind of push forward at least English language Orthodox media. That this, God willing, we can hopefully humbly say this, that this show became a groundbreaking thing. That the idea that you would sit there for years and read the writings of one author, and that would be an Orthodox Christian podcast. That was a new thing in 2019. It's crazy to say that, but that was a new thing in 2019. And so for me, the most beautiful thing about that was number one, the AFR's willingness to do it, but then number two, the just sheer enthusiasm with which all the people who joined in, brought to the table, right? Like, wait, you're doing a Tolkien podcast on an Orthodox media outlet? Please, don't throw me in that briar patch. And how many people were so ready to dive into it, and I mean, there's, as I say, it was the friendships we made along the way. There's multiple people that I kind of knew, that actually I became much better friends with as a result of doing this podcast. And I don't want to start listing off names because I'm sure that I will miss someone. But I've loved that. I've loved the running gags. I've loved the fact that we have this sort of ongoing competition between Deacon Nicholas Kotar and Dr. Cheryl Jenkins as to who's been on it the most. I'm not sure actually who's currently in the lead
I think it's Kotar.
It's Kotar as of today.
I think it's
probably.
Kotar, yeah.
But so yeah, I don't know. It's just Amon Sûl in many ways has been the show that has been closest to my heart, in terms of conversation podcasts. That's not to I can hear Mike Lensman off in the corner sobbing or whatever, like, what are you talking about? But I love each of my this is going to sound weird again, but like literally I think there's 9 Ancient Faith Radio podcasts now with my name on them.
And they're all like your children. You don't have any favorites, but obviously this one.
Yeah, so in some ways this feels like, giving a hug to one of my kids and sending him off to school for the first time now that he's 5 years old. So I don't know. That's a big mess of thoughts about the history of this podcast. I mean, in podcast years, 5.5 years is almost ancient.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely like retirement age for most. I once read, I think I've said this before on several shows, the average length of a podcast on the internet is 7 episodes. That's the average length. So most do as many as 7 episodes and then quit.
Yeah.
So here we are in 11:1. So good job, you guys.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. I mean, for me, man, there's so many great episodes. I was like sitting here going back through like old scripts of episodes, and obviously I came into the project a little late. I think we'll talk about that in a minute. Uh, but this has been just a wonderful thing. I think that my favorite part about this has been honestly just getting to know and getting to work with Father Andrew and becoming friends with him.
Well,
And this is really my uh basically where I cut my teeth doing podcasting. I'd done a few small things before, but whenever I started Amon Sûl and basically learning how to do it, and then Father Andrew, always, catching up with me after an episode and being like, all right, you talked a little too much in this part and you got to give the guest a little more room and things like that. It's just been great, and it's been a beautiful experience, and it's been great to get to know everyone at Ancient Faith. I feel like everybody who's been a host on this show is just such a good friend of mine now, and that because we have this thing in common with each other. And I my other favorite moment, which is sort of from the podcast, was Doxmoot a couple of years ago when we did the Dream of the Rood in front of a relic of the True Cross, and
yeah.
that is a moment that is forever etched in my memory.
I should
So
say, by the way, just to add a little bit of context to that, is now we actually have here in Emmaus a hand cross into which that relic has been installed,
yeah,
and it's painted with iconography, hand painted, and on the back are lines from the Dream of the Rood.
yeah,
So
that's
I just
incredible.
had to put that out there. If anyone wants
That's
to come and
incredible.
venerate it, you're welcome to come on down.
I love that.
Not the
So
first time that's been done, by the way. We were talking about this. There are at least a couple of crosses that survive from the Anglo-Saxon period. They're really large ones, which is probably why they survived, but seems to indicate the poem was relatively well known. In my mind, it's not at all inconceivable to think of it being etched on something like a hand cross. But yeah, it's just so great.
yeah.
So great.
And I'll add, by the way, I, I'm trying to remember. I don't, forgive me, Richard. I don't remember our first contact, actually. Like if someone said, well, how did you guys meet? I'd be like, I
Yeah.
don't
I
know.
can tell the story in a minute.
Okay. But
I know we have a segment for that.
I do remember. Okay. Okay. But
Yeah.
I do remember, like I still have sitting in my inbox, well, not my inbox, but in my archives, my email archives,
Hmm.
email that you sent to the Amon Sûl
Hmm.
podcast before you ever started with
I
it.
think it
Like,
was like kind of an actually email too.
I'm sure.
Well, I had assumed, and maybe we just skip right ahead to that. Although, I mean,
Okay, sure.
this has been a beautiful journey to watch for you both. It's been beautiful to share a little bit, and it's a beautiful thing, if a little bit daunting to consider coming on and carrying all of that burden and responsibility. But what you all have done here has been magnificent, and it's a beautiful thing to be a part of. So, anyway, since I'm the new host, not scare quotes, but I have the job of saying we need to move on to our next segment, which is
Okay.
really just going to be a continuation.
Yeah.
So this is the part of the show where usually we ask our guest hosts to share something about themselves and how they came to connect with Tolkien's works. But both of you have talked a lot about that. So this time I wanted to ask you to tell the story of how the podcast began and of how Richard came to be involved. Really, the two of you have formed, as you've already kind of started to mention, you've really formed a beautiful friendship and collaboration that seems to have pretty much, or completely sprung out of this podcast. I'd love to hear the story of how all that came about. I'm sure our listeners, our viewers, and your future listeners there on the Great Tales would really love to hear how that came about as you move on to this exciting project that you're beginning. But
Do you want me to tell the story as I remember it, Father, and then you can correct me?
Go for it. Yeah. I mean, I already
Okay.
mentioned a little bit about how the podcast began, and I'll be honest, actually. I'll say this. I don't know that I've said this before on the show. It began because it had actually been a number of years since I had read any Tolkien. Which I know seems so weird. Like, aren't we supposed to be always reading it like all the time, no matter what, right? You know,
well,
after
you
you
are if you want to be ready for they're taking the Hobbits to Isengard. But
that's right. That's right. I accept defeat now. But it had been a while, and I don't know, I something reminded me like, hey, you love those books. Uh you love those books. Why haven't you, picked one up, and it was some years actually. And so I think it was in winter of 2018 that I picked up, I can't remember which book it was now, and started reading. I was like, wow, this is so great. And by that point, I'd been podcasting for a while with Ancient Faith Radio. I mean, I'd started with Ancient Faith Radio doing podcasting in 2009.
Yeah.
So by that point, it had been almost a decade that I had been doing stuff with Ancient Faith Radio. And so I was, my mind is always trying to come up with something new and fun to do. Probably having been formed in my young adulthood and in my teenagerhood by doing theater, like there's always a new show, there's always a new thing to bring out. And so as I was getting back into that, then I thought this idea of like, hey, wait a minute. I wonder if Ancient Faith Radio would be willing to do this kind of thing. And so for me, it was actually a way to kind of recommit to my love for Tolkien that had kind of lain dormant for a few years at least. I don't remember even how long it was. But yeah, so I mean, Richard joined about 2 years later. I think it was
1 year in. 1 year in.
1 year in. Oh, so was it 20?
Yeah, so my first episode was the 1 year anniversary episode.
Okay.
And this is how I remember this. So I've been kind of after having done my degree in Germanic philology, I was writing and speaking I was writing like for Tolkien publications and speaking at Inklings conferences and things like that. And Rebecca Robney, who I think is an early guest that you had on the show, and as far as I know, still listens to this podcast. So hi, Rebecca. I think I last saw you at a Pan-Orthodox Vespers during Great Lent. She, I think, recommended me to you, and I'd already kind of written into the show a couple of times, and I think she was the one, I could be wrong about this, but I think she was the one that said, you'd have this guy on the show. And so I came in on for the Monday, February, or Tuesday, February the 25th episode, which was the episode of Special Magnificence,
yeah,
obviously, which has some kind of a connection to the 111st episode we're doing now,
Indeed.
Thematically. And that's when I came in, and I think we just talked about Tolkien as a philologist and talked about like what sort of thing is a philologist. And I really enjoyed that because it was very frustrating for me to listen to the podcast. And when I say that, what I mean is that when you are listening to two other people talk about something that you really love and know a lot about, and you cannot join the conversation, that is one of the most frustrating feelings for me. I actually have a hard time now sometimes like listening to my friends' podcasts because they're my friends and I'm used to talking to them. And so when I hear them talking to each other, I'm like, oh, but, I want to interject something and be a part of that conversation. And so it was really kind of allowed me to vent my spleen a little bit. And it was really great. And that kind of began, I think, the kind of the friendship. And so we started talking on Messenger and talking on Facebook and all these other things. And a few like it was maybe fall or late summer or fall of that same year, I just started messaging Father Andrew with like, hey, I've got ideas for other episodes. Do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? And I think at some point, this is when Father Andrew was like, well, why don't you just come on the show with me?
Yeah.
And I don't know what possessed you to even like say something like that. But I said, yeah, why don't I do that? And it was just and that's kind of how it started.
I mean, yeah, so I think that you came on as a persistent host.
Yeah.
In January of 2021.
That's so my first episode was December 20th, 2020.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So January 2021. Yeah.
And the biggest thought that I had at the time actually was, so in 2020 is when I started working for Ancient Faith Ministries in August of 2020. So by that point, Amon Sûl had been going for a year and a few months. And actually, when Amon Sûl started, so this is another bit of background that's probably never been shared. When Amon Sûl started, there was already a lot of work being done to get me hired by Ancient Faith Ministries. It actually took from the conception of me being hired to my being hired, took 3 years, actually, because there were so many puzzle pieces that had to go together to make that picture. And so one of the ideas that I had was, hey, this will be a really cool big project because it was a fairly high level of production, compared to other stuff that was going on at the time and so forth. And so, I had been working, I started working for Ancient Faith in August of 2020, and I was having so much fun with Amon Sûl. But I also was adding on all these other projects. Like, so Lord of Spirits was being conceived of at that point. It started in September of that year. I was already beginning to form the ideas that eventually became the Wolf on the Cross, and now also the Orthodox Pilgrim podcast, and some other stuff, because my job was mainly to make content. So I was coming up with new, ideas for content. And I thought to myself, I want to do more Tolkien stuff, but I also thought, I mean, that's a bunch of work, and I kind of also want to do these other things, but I want more Orthodox Tolkien stuff, and so that's I was like, hey, wait a minute, I have an idea. I could make someone double my podcast. I could just make someone do some of the work, and we'll have twice the podcast. And that's exactly what happened. And so even though it's not been perfectly regular for the last now 3.5 years that Richard has been the persistent other host, we haven't gotten exactly 2 episodes a month. It's been pretty much 2 episodes a month for most of this time.
Pretty much. The summer was a little rough for both of us, but
yeah, travel and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
stuff happens.
Yeah,
stuff
exactly,
happens.
exactly. But yeah, that's why we're now here with 111 episodes.
Yeah.
5.5 years in. So, yeah, it's just been grand. And there's been a lot of different concepts about how to build episodes, but it's been like the format that we came up with for the very first episode has been pretty persistent for most of what we've done.
Yeah.
With some exceptions, like we put on lectures or little mini-sodes and this sort of thing. But of course, it's going to be your deal now, Father Anthony. So if you want to radically revamp the whole thing, as long as you're talking about Tolkien,
completely change the format.
Yeah, you could totally change it. Make it some sort of weird variety show or something like that.
Well, I thought we might shift it to talk about Charles Williams, but
no.
I will burn the studio. No, I'm
not that witch doctor, as
people
called him.
People always ask me, is like, what do you think about Charles Williams? And I always tell people, probably don't read him. Like, probably don't. I mean, like, he's got some interesting stuff, but the guy is,
yes, smart dude, some interesting stuff, but deeply, deeply disturbing at points.
Yeah.
Really disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That hideous strength, and that's about as much as
that's as close as you need to get.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'll also say, like, I think one of the things that Richard and I discovered as we were doing Amon Sûl together was we just really liked each other, and a big transition / leap forward / deepening of our friendship was that we went on pilgrimage together to Lithuania. I think I can't speak for women, but I know that men often, if they go through something together, that often becomes a formative thing for the relationship as well. And that's the thing that we, literally we hung out for a week and a half all day long, every single day.
Yeah.
Traversing the ancestral land of my family. So yeah, it's just been, the difficulty has been, the problem when you have someone that you really like working with is that a lot of other people might like working with them too. And so there's just too many projects to do.
Yeah.
But we're carving them out. And I think part of the reason that the Great Tales, not to plug this too much, but actually by the time this airs, episode 1 of the Great Tales will be out. In fact, maybe even episode 2, I'm not sure. So check it out, everybody, if you haven't done so.
Plug away. This is your space. That's the whole point. Tell the story, lead it into your new project. Say, follow it over here, and leave poor Father Anthony alone in his own space.
Hey, you'll have plenty of time to talk from now. I mean, so the Great Tales in many ways is going to be the same kind of thing, but with other literature, frankly, you know. Um, but part of the reason that it exists, not the only reason, but part of the reason that it exists now is that while Richard and I felt like we had completed something in terms of doing Tolkien stuff together, we wanted to continue doing this kind of thing together.
Right. And I think that this is something that, how do I express this? So Orthodox online media has gone through a series of, let us say, phases, right? And some of them have been profitable and maybe some of them not so much.
Yeah.
But one of the things that it seems like we really do need is for people to like get out of the space of just talking about apologetics or just even doing, I know we all love conversion stories, but like at some point you need to sort of move out of the mode of doing apologetics and conversion stories and arguing with, I don't know, Catholics or whatever else. And if there's going to be some kind of, you could say like long-term Orthodox culture, especially here in America, I know we have listeners other places, but if we're going to have some kind of a long-term Orthodox culture, then we need to start thinking really seriously about what that means. How do you tell stories? How do you educate well? How do you do these different things? And so for me, Tolkien was, an important introduction to all of that. And so it's sort of fitting that that is where I began to kind of speak and operate in this space. But last night I was reading to the kids out of the Synaxarion, reading about Saint Artemius, who, as everyone knows, is the patron saint of testicular disorders. And I don't know if you've ever read. Do you not know about this? I'm really sorry for hijacking this podcast.
Do we really need to go?
So there's a 6th century. I'm just going to say this. Okay, so there's a 6th century collection of miracles. It's 44, I think, miracles attributed to Saint Artemius. I'm going to send you something later, both of you, something later, which I'm not going to read here on the podcast, but it's about all of these different miracles associated with Saint Artemius. But Saint Artemius was a great martyr who was martyred under the reign of Julian the Apostate. One of the things that Julian did was to ban the use of Homer and other works of classical Greek paganism by Christian educators, which implies two things. First of all, that they were already using that as the basis of education. And secondly, that there was this sort of the sense that if I take this away from them, then they won't be able to be properly educated, and then they won't be able to hold positions in the government, and then we'll get rid of all these Christians in sort of this long-term war of attrition. Well, Julian failed. He eventually got, stabbed, probably by another saint. And then but now basically the Julians of the world have kind of succeeded in that and succeeded in kind of taking away the things that were really the basis for, I don't even want to say like Western culture or Western education, because I've decided I hate those words, but something like the basis for like a really humane education, right? If you want to be a good human being, if you want to have a beautiful soul, that this is actually where your education begins. And so those are the things that have been kind of really on my mind, especially as my kids get older and we homeschool them. And I'm really looking forward to getting to share all of that. And for me, that journey really did begin with Tolkien, because I didn't have that kind of education growing up. But reading Tolkien made me want to say, why is he like this? How do you become this kind of person? And that's kind of what drew me into that whole world. So I am excited about it because I feel like it's probably the next step for what we need in the, let's say, the Orthodox online space right now, is not just people talking about apologetics or whatever, but actually, it's time to do a little more in the way of culture building. And that's that's what I'm all about.
Yeah.
So
I mean, one of the things that, at least here in the West, Orthodox Christians often talk about culture, Orthodox culture, and the way it enculturates and how it affects a whole culture and all this kind of stuff. But most of the sort of public facing stuff, at least on the internet, is actually about perimeter things. You
Yes.
know, it's largely about boundary forming and boundary
Right.
enforcing and defending, like which is okay and understandable. But like, is there anything inside the perimeter? Like, is there any actual content in there? You know, and it might seem ironic that we have dwelt on a Catholic writer for the last 5.5 years, and we're pointing at that as being this, but Orthodoxy has always done that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if you mentioned, you know, Homer and so forth. I mean, for crying out loud, if early Christians can read pagan authors and say, okay, here is Orthodox culture that's developing out of talking about pagan authors, absolutely we can read heterodox Christian authors and do the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so we're, you know, Great Tales is going to be about, frankly, engaging a lot of those pagan authors, but not
Right.
just pagans, also legendary Christian texts and kind of almost anything pre-modern, frankly.
Yeah.
And we might once in a while dip into something in the Inklings realm. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? But mostly it's going to be about really old stuff, which is what
Yeah.
the Inklings themselves uh, would have
We're
preferred.
interested in. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's what they were
That's right.
doing.
Any chance you want to give a teaser for what you'll talk about first, even though everyone else will already know about it, and I'm only asking for myself?
So first, we're going to look at Saint Basil's letter to young men as a template for how you should read this, you could say, pre-Christian literature as an Orthodox Christian.
Sure.
And then I think the intent after that will be to go into Homer, and we'll sort of read Homer from a couple of different perspectives. One would be just looking at Homer kind of on his own, which is quite wonderful. And then especially if you like violence. And then but then secondly, there is a really rich allegorical tradition in the Christian East for reading Homer as an allegory, having to do with virtue and the progression of the soul and all these different things. And that reading of Homer was intuitive. I mean, people talk about, you know, the recovery of classical education. Unfortunately, a lot of times when people talk about classical education, they just mean something like, you know, like the three, you know, it's just the trivium is like 3 developmental stages or something. They mean a bunch of different things. As far as I'm concerned, classical education means educating like, you know, the classical people did. And so which includes Homer and also wrestling. And but the I'm really serious about that, by the way. If you don't have sports, it's not classical education. But anyway, um, there's a so in the West, obviously, there's this whole thing where like they get cut off from Greek culture and then they start to rediscover it during the Renaissance, but they rediscover it with this really long proximity, and it that is part of the idea that comes about in the Renaissance and the Reformation for basically rejecting the medieval Christian era. In the East, though, we never stopped being able to read Homer in Greek, right? And so there arose a really organic tradition of how do you educate a Christian child using Homer, and what's the best way to understand Homer? And it's, especially for people who are converts, almost completely unknown to anybody. And so that's one of the first things that I'm excited about bringing to people, and kind of, you know, giving people resources for how to read Homer. And then we'll do other things. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or we'll just do Homer for 6 years. It'll just depend on how successfully Father Andrew can rein me in. So we'll see.
Does that mean you're going to do some dactylic hexameter too?
We'll definitely talk about that. We'll definitely talk about that. We'll have to get somebody who's better at Attic Greek than I am to help us out with some.
Oh, well, but maybe you should be on our new podcast.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I'm interviewing because I don't have enough on my plate.
Yeah. So as Richard says, you know, again, when this airs, the first episode or two of the Great Tales should be out. First episode on Saint Basil, kind of laying out the basis for the whole show. And then doing some Homer, but also like the first few episodes of the Great Tales are going to be kind of like a sampler platter, right? We're going to bring out a number of the kinds of things that we have in the kitchen. So one obviously will be some Homer, but we are also going to bring out of there something with a more northerly flavor, and discuss some of
and perhaps something with a more Arthurian flavor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, there will be Norsemen. There will be knights in shining armor. There will be grails. All of these things will be there, and we'll reach out. Like, I'm actually just dying to talk about Baltic fairy tales in a way that I have not yet had a chance
I'm
to.
so deeply surprised. Shocked, I say, shocked.
So yeah, it'll be fairy tales, it'll be legends, it'll be mythology, all that kind of stuff. It's just going to be a philological playground.
You're just going to round up all the usual suspects then.
And I already have, Father Andrew doesn't even know this, but I already have some pre-Christian Ethiopian epics for us to dig into. So
how about that?
I have, it's going to be a veritable smorgasbord, to use a good Scandinavian word.
Yeah. So, and we'll be having guests, every so often for sure. Maybe even some of the same people, probably some of the same people that have been on Amon Sûl, because weirdly enough, there's a big Venn diagram of people that sort of like all of this kind of thing. But definitely some new faces and voices as well. And it's going to be, on YouTube, but there will be also an audio podcast as well.
For you purists.
Yeah.
It's like baseball. Never watch baseball on TV. Real baseball fans listen to it on the radio.
I don't think it's an issue of purism. I think it's a matter of time management. I don't know how everyone finds all this time to sit there and watch YouTube videos. I keep up with podcasts when I'm walking and running, because otherwise, who has the time?
People do. It's interesting, actually. There are some things I've done that get a lot more truck on YouTube than they do the audio only version. And I mean, I was being a Gen Xer, I was initially skeptical myself, but now I'm sold now on the value of YouTube, even though there's a lot of less useful things on the platform as well. And when it comes to content creation, in a lot of ways, more is more, as long as it's good quality, the whole time. So
fair enough.
So here we are. YouTube is looking at our faces right now. So here we are.
God help us all. I'm really excited about this. Especially what you started with, Richard, saying, we need to not focus exclusively on that argumentative apologetics. The more I do catechesis, the more I'm like, just stop it. Understand the creed, live the faith. And if you never have an argument with anyone else again, that would really be actually profoundly good for your spiritual life. This is not.
Yeah. I mean, apologetics absolutely has a place, but like, we need to also kind of in some ways get past that and get to just living it. And this is what the boundaries are for. This is, this is what the land is for.
Apologetics has a place. Owning the West just needs to be laid aside and done.
Father Patrick Henry Reardon said that if you focus on apologetics and you make that the basis of like everything you do, and he was talking about making like the driver of your theology, then you allow the unregenerate mind to become basically the measure by which the faith is, like the rule by which the faith is measured. Yeah. He said it better than that, but that's what he said. And it's always kind of stuck with me. And you're right. It does have a place. Obviously, we all have catechetical duties, and that's one of the ways I serve in my parish, and you're both priests. So there is a place for answering objections, answering questions, things like that. But man, that's actually not life. That's not what life is.
Yeah.
We need to be able to give an account for the hope that is in us.
Yes.
And then live.
But you better have some hope.
And that's probably a good place to wind down here. I'm really looking forward to what you all are going to be doing. But, stay tuned to that space and I guess to this space for parallel conversations on those lines. So anyway, yes, this was supposed to be your listener questions and comments, and we didn't discuss any of those today, dear listener. That's only for this episode. Please feel free to send any thoughts to us at amonsul@ancientfaith.com. or messaging via the Facebook page, and you will probably hear it on an episode to come, but it might not be for 10 years. So
that's how it goes.
This brings us to the main portion of our episode today. Now that we're an hour in, we decided to take advantage of the fact that Father Andrew and Richard would at some point have to have a final episode, and I would have to have a first episode. So instead of making those separate things, we're combining them together into one extravaganza, as it were. So all of us can discuss the Lord of the Rings in general and specifically go over the all-important prologue. So I'm just going to read the first very little bit of this. So we hear, how does Tolkien introduce himself to his readers? I didn't put this in the script, but this is how he begins. Prologue, concerning hobbits. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. And then he goes on. So I think this is amazing. Here is the origins of this story, and I'm going to tell you some background stuff because clearly you're interested in doing that.
Yeah. And it's funny because he plays it up like this is some ancient or pre-modern text that I published bits of this earlier under under this other title, like this sort of academic pretense, which is I don't know, I don't even remember. I read all of these things for the first time when I was a little kid, and I don't remember how I understood that. I don't know if I took it literally or if I understood already this is a frame narrative of some kind. I don't know. It's just been with me for so
I
long.
took it as hobbits must actually be a well-established bit of folklore that I've just never heard of. And so he's educating me. And like hobbits are in the same category somehow as like fairies and dwarves and other things like this. I mean, that's basically how he makes you think about it. And you're like, well, I've heard of fairies before. Hobbits must be some other kind of fairy. You have to remember that when I read the books for the first time, it was I found these books, The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring, in the attic of my house. I've told the story many times, but I believe that I read them out of order. I believe that I read The Fellowship of the Ring first because I mean, I was 8 or 9 and there was nothing, I just showed them to mom and said, "Can I read these?" And she said, "Yeah, you'll like those books." And so, with just these old yellow Del Rey paperbacks or whatever. And so I had no sense of where to begin or what I was getting myself into or the deep ramifications this would have for my life, 3 decades down the road. Um, but so when I started reading, I think I started there at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring with concerning hobbits, and I was just like, oh, there must be stuff about hobbits that I don't know that I should probably, figure out and everything. And of course, so that's, I mean, I think that the prologue is beautiful, especially if you take it in kind of context with the appendices and all that stuff, and sort of the kind of those two things together is the sort of quasi-academic frame, which is amazing because Tolkien is basically going back over his own stuff and writing about it at a level remove.
Yeah.
Right. He's going back over his own work over the last several decades, and he's writing about it at a level remove as though he's an academic studying somebody else's works.
Right.
And that's the container in which the Lord of the Rings is to be interpreted and understood.
Yeah. I have to say though, I think the idea that The Hobbit is the first part of the Red Book of Westmarch is a total gaslight. Because if you read it, it does not, I mean, it's clearly like a children's story. And there's
until the end,
this narrator who says things like, makes references to freight trains and, whatever. So
the balls.
It's right. It's a total gaslight. And I know that I know that he started working on a revised version of The Hobbit. Like he wanted to rewrite it in this kind of more high style, And so that if that were the book that he had written, then this bit about the Hobbit being the first part of the Red Book of Westmarch, just having been published earlier, might make sense. But it's a total gaslight with the text as it is. That's not. They are very different books in terms of their tone in so many ways, especially the beginning of The Hobbit.
Except
Uh,
he makes it kind of work because within the frame, even as it is, the Hobbit is Bilbo's authorship and Lord of the Rings is Frodo's authorship. And you just add in that little additional idea. And of course, the translator is updating the
Right.
references
yeah.
relevant to children, and there you
Yeah.
go.
I have just 3 words to say to that. Smells like elves.
I think I vaguely remember how I responded to this prologue myself, though, and it was one of those irrelevant stuff, get me onto the story, irrelevant stuff, but get me onto the story, but also that tiny little, switch flipped in my brain of there's more information to come back to now. I want to learn more about this. I want to dig more deeply into it.
Hmm.
Frankly, strange to say, it's like whatever academic inclinations I have, whatever, historical, liturgical, those are being formed and fashioned just in the way he writes it. There's this aspirational. Of course, you are the sort of person that wants to know about, manuscript histories and provenance and how this goes together and, what scholarly work is behind this. And I'm just inviting you to dig more deeply when you're ready. But, this is the path of breadcrumbs to follow. And
Yeah,
I've been following that all my life. It's yeah.
I know. I mean, in so many ways, I think, especially for those of us that have been reading this since we were young, this formed expectations in us of what a good story ought to be
Yeah.
and the kinds of frames within which it should be situated. Like of course a good story should have some legendary academic material attached to
Well,
it.
okay, think about if you pick up an edition of, I don't know, the Aeneid or something like that, right? You're going to get a little introduction at the beginning, which is going to tell you here's the manuscripts that we're using, and here's the historical context and the everything that's going on with Augustus and with Virgil and all this stuff. You're going to get that kind of lengthy introduction, and then you're going to get the actual story, right?
Yeah.
And obviously sometimes those introductions are kind of garbage and you can skip them, but I think that Tolkien, I think that the prologue is actually a very important part of the frame, because that's basically what he's doing, is he's saying the Hobbit is an important document of record which everyone has read. And of course by this point probably everyone has read the Hobbit because it was really popular. But he's saying basically the Hobbit is an important document of record, and I want to give you some additional information about hobbits before we proceed. And then basically goes into, here's a nice little anthropological overview of their culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe, Father Andrew, we should have you actually read a little bit of that overview here.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So here's where he actually starts telling you what a hobbit is. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today. For they love peace and quiet and good tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a water mill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days, they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find.
By the way, the implication there that you could still find a hobbit.
Right. Like there's maybe you haven't met one, reader, but they are around.
That is how I interpreted that at 9 years old, and to this day, that is still the reading in my head, is like Tolkien saying, "Oh, but they're still around. Maybe that's how I know these things."
But then the disappointing bit a little bit later that they're only to be
Yes.
found in certain places which were not where I lived.
No. No. Not Dallas,
Yes.
Texas.
Yes. But I mean, once you accept this, right? Like by the time you like as I am, like next year I will be turning 50. I fully expect arriving at 50 years old that a wizard should show up at my door and send me off on an adventure with dwarves. Or, to go and lose an object of great value and power.
One or the other.
In Mother Russia, you are the wizard.
I know it's true. Like,
I'm the one that doesn't leave my
right.
house.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's been a joke. Like when, when Richard and I were preparing to go to Lithuania, um, it came out that he had never left the United States, although he had a passport because he was going to.
Yeah.
at one point, but it just that
Never
project
materialized.
tanked.
Yep.
And so then there was a lot of obvious jokes made about me being a wizard, taking him off, sending him off into the blue on some adventure.
You even have a gray cassock, so like it kind of
I do have a
kind
great
of worked.
cast.
Kind of worked.
Just need a pointed hat.
Do
My
you
eyebrows, though, I do not have the eyebrow game. Although I met someone this last summer who has the Gandalf level eyebrow game, and that is Archbishop Rowan Williams, former
Oh,
Archbishop of
yeah,
Canterbury.
he does. He does
That
have.
man has eyebrow game that is, I mean this with the most respect and admiration. And I getting to interview him actually was one of the great moments of my life, honestly. But yes, he definitely has the Gandalf level eyebrow game.
I, I should say, not to jump away from eyebrows, but I know we don't or have not, as a habit, gotten into Tolkien's biography, but one can't read this also without getting that really strong sense of his resentment of the industrial overdevelopment of the part of his part of the country of the Midlands there and
Yeah.
in Old Mercia.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was just rereading. He did a lecture on dragons in on New Year's Day, 1938, just months after The Hobbit was published. He gave a lecture to kids at a museum, I think in Oxford, on that day. And at one point in the lecture, he says, you know, look, if you don't think you've seen a dragon, just go out and look at the roads. The roads used to be yellow and gray and red and the color of the earth. He said, but now it's clear that they are the tracks of dragons' tails.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so
And
which
especially
is an
in Norse
amazing,
mythology, dragons drag themselves across the ground, and it creates these ruts that look like tire tracks.
yeah,
they're
exactly,
hot, like
exactly.
slimes and heats
Yeah.
and
Right, right. So yeah, I mean that's an amazing way of expressing this um feeling of loss that he has. Um, but in terms of the thing that he says he always desired dragons with a great desire,
no,
you know.
exactly. Uh, but hobbits, we understand, are not far distant from us either. They're close to us. Richard, we've got the next bit here. What if you would read
Yeah.
that?
It says, it is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. Of old, they spoke the languages of men after their own fashion and liked and disliked much the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the councils of the wise and the great.
So what he does here is just so barefaced and audacious. It is clear hobbits had lived quietly in Middle Earth for many long years. It's not clear at all. You just made that up on the spot. I,
Is
I
it
mean,
Who do you think is the author of the prologue in the frame narrative? Is it the translator or is it the redactor at Minas Tirith?
well, that's
That
it.
so that would be an important question to me because it gives context to this idea that we all know about hobbits, but most people don't see them anymore. Is that because most people just have never been to the Shire, which is off limits to men, per the order of King Elisar? Or is it that this is set in modern times and it's the translator speaking?
I think this has to be the translator speaking. It's just because of the way in the apparatus later on he gives the list of all of the hands that have had
Hmm. Hmm.
on the original text before, but also because it's so clearly Tolkien putting in a belated plug for publication of the Silmarillion. He's trying to make
The elves have records, as everyone knows.
and this is this isn't the only time he does this. There's like 5 or 6 different references to the
Yeah.
the rest of the story.
I mean, it worked. Everybody was like, so what about this? What about these elvish histories? Like, I would have been that guy. I would have been like,
Yeah. I mean, to me also, like this prologue is still, it's not as pronounced, but this is still in some ways the same voice of the narrator of The Hobbit.
that's right. And I would argue that even the first chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring is still in that voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the fox, well, even not just the first chapter, the first chapters. I mean, the fox walking past the hobbits and being like, I wonder what's going on there. Like
Yeah.
an odd detail, to be sure.
Yeah.
But still that
It's
children's narrator's voice. But also, he's playing with this. There's been, I don't remember any sense in even The Hobbit that the elves and the men were relatives, right? Except that they sort of, exist together. But all of a sudden now you have this sense hobbits are relatives of ours, and the elves are too.
more
Uh,
distantly.
and
And
dwarves apparently, that's a whole lot of questions that are being
yes,
not begged but invited.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, arguably dwarves are not, if you read the Silmarillion, you know,
the boy.
not
All
to
right,
go off
so
on a big tangent,
if we're gonna get into like pre-modern taxonomy, I mean the sort of it's kind of this, everything that swims in the ocean is a fish kind of a thing,
right?
right?
Yeah.
And so dwarves are like humans, maybe more so than elves because they have more traits in common with us. They do get old and die eventually, et cetera, et cetera. So you could say like there's a likeness there. It doesn't mean they're of our kind.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry.
Not
Just
yet, because there is at least some sense that they will be counted among the children of the Iluvatar at the
yeah.
end in the music, but that's
They're,
not.
Difficult question.
they're related through adoption.
Well, yeah, that's a good way to put that actually.
Yeah, which is
So
totally a thing.
But yeah, the pushing of the idea that there's records of the elves is huge. Uh, anyway, so there's a lot of world building going on. There's a lot of ruins effectively being laid out there. But regardless, we should move on. And start actually, he sums up the whole history of what has come before and how the hobbits got there. Father Andrew, would you read that substantial quote?
Yeah. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear nonetheless from these legends, and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood.
So I see a couple of things that I love here, and I love both of your comments on this. The connection and the description of those upper vales of Anduin, that's going to be recognizable to his readers because important things happen in those upper vales of Anduin. That's where they meet Beorn. And so he's making this direct, well, veiled but direct. It's not even oblique connection of the hobbits with Beorn and that Anglo-Saxon appearance in the Hobbit. And I'm guessing both of you might have stuff to say about that.
I mean, it's, in some ways, this is a legendary lair of Europe, right? This idea of moving west, which historically we know is the case. It seems like, for instance, that most Indo-European people probably started in what is roughly kind of Ukraine, frankly. in the ancient
There's so,
ancient.
I mean, yeah, that's mildly controversial, but it's either like somewhere in the Caucasus or maybe in what used to be called Anatolia. I mean, it's yeah, there's a couple of different hypotheses
Yeah,
about this.
somewhere around the Black Sea.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I think it's we've talked about this before, but the the experience of the sort of prehistoric Germanic peoples. It's not even quite right to say prehistoric Germanic peoples, but you know when they first enter the recorded history of basically antiquity, right? That they're starting somewhere. They're certainly coming from somewhere around the Black Sea and moving west and moving north.
Mm.
And as they're moving west and they're moving north and settling in Scandinavia, they certainly Scandinavia, Western Europe, etc. They certainly encounter the real Mirkwood, which was this basically a massive forest that covered most of what we would now think of as like modern day Germany and France. And that's the real, you know, the Mirkwieder, right? That's the real Mirkwood. And it was, as you can imagine, a huge, dark, scary, terrifying place. You can ask Varus about this. You know, who lost a couple of legions in one of in that same forest, right? And so that's the kind of you know that's the kind of the sense here is you know moving towards the west. We don't exactly know why we're migrating, but it's of this in the I talked about this at Doxamut, in the ancient consciousness of Northern Europe. There's this sense that there are always enemies behind you, and it's the Huns. Those are the enemies behind you, and that as you have the enemies behind you, you're moving towards the west because you're you know until basically you hit the sea, and then it's kind of like, well, this is as far as we can go.
Yeah.
And the hobbits are part of this migration, and when you get into the stuff that Tolkien writes about like the Hobbit calendar and everything else, it's very very clear that it's just this it's the same calendar as the Northmen, the rest of the Northmen use. And so they're certainly culturally related in some way, and you get little things like this too with the linguistic similarities between the language of the Rohirrim and then the Hobbits, right? Stuff like that. You know, it's very clear that there is a kind of a shared culture somehow, except that as far as we know, there were never, you know, like half, you know, like miniature Swedish, you know, or something like that, you know, like
It's fun. I didn't select this for us to read, but we even get a reference to that later in the prologue, talking about Meriadoc Brandybuck and his books that he wrote, mainly engaging with the linguistic connections between the Rohirrim and the
Yeah.
Hobbits.
that's what it is. I
Miniature
really like the idea that Mary, who becomes like this real big hero at the end, and he's just like, as he, you know, once he's done being hero, he's like, philology.
Why not?
Does it
Why
ever go
not?
the other way? Do
Yeah.
philologists become heroes?
Well, you know, maybe. Or they become like the worst elf ever. So
I,
What
I
go
just
ahead.
have to say, by the way, when you said miniature Swedish, I was like, what, like a blonde guy that's only 6 feet tall? Is that
yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Somebody asked, I recently was identified um by a the lady running the register at the hobby store as white tall man, which is a great revert. So Tolkien talks about why you can say green the great green dragon, but not the green great dragon, right? And so this is my version of that apparently is not tall white man, but the white tall man. And so somebody said, "How tall are you?" And I said, "I'm man high." So I'm two Rengar high, which is the Númenórean yard, basically, which is 3 feet 2 inches. And so the hobbits are halflings. They call that by the Dunedain because they're only one Renga high, which is about average 3 feet 2 inch tall. So,
Ah.
yep.
Now, what you read just there, I do want to note we get
Hmm.
a nice connection with Mirkwood and the Shadow in Mirkwood. This is belated now because our conversation has wandered. But we get the connection to the appearance of the necromancer briefly in The Hobbit and foreshadowing of the whole, point and conceit of the Hobbit, and this fascinating connection that the Hobbits have a long relationship with Sauron, which is basically running away from him.
Yep.
And now the whole story will be one Hobbit, well, four Hobbits, and then two who go the other way to fix what no one else can fix.
In a world, one Hobbit, no, two, four, no, two.
Back to
Dark Lord. Sorry.
oh, and also we're going to talk about this a little later, but there is this really strong connection that the Shire is, in Tolkien's mind, England, and uh, uh, and that interestingly brings us to the migrations of the Anglo-Saxons to England. And, well, first he describes. First, Tolkien describes the threefold division of the hobbits, the
Right.
Harfoots and Stoors, and the Fallowhides, which I misspelled, but Fallowhides, and their characteristics. But then he talks about who led them into the Shire for the
Right.
first time. And Richard, you're going to have a
Yeah.
lot to this, so please read this for us.
So it's two Fallowhide brothers. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years. It was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Fallowhide brothers Marco and Blanco set out from Bree, and having obtained, or Marcho and Blanco set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the Brown River Baranduin with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone bows that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads speed the king's messengers. So there's some obvious parallels here between the famous story. So you have three basically tribes of hobbits. So there's the famous story, and Father Andrew was recently telling me that Tom Holland has a podcast out now saying this never happened. I remain incredibly skeptical of that theory, so I'll just tell you the way that most people tell the story, and certainly the way that it's traditionally told, which is most of what I care about, which is that there are three Germanic tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the nowadays we'd
Giants.
say the Jutes,
Giants.
but it's more like Yots. And they were originally invited, probably as mercenaries, by the Britons to settle along the eastern and southeastern coast of the Isle of Britain.
The Saxons.
And yeah, the Saxon shore. And over time, they said, hey, this place is pretty nice. Maybe we'll stay. And so you can argue about whether or not this was a big invasion. I think most people think it was not a big invasion, but it was something that happened in waves. First, and it's a pretty common story across, the decaying Western Empire, right? Which is you invite some barbarians, and they come in first as mercenaries, and then they kind of rise to positions of authority, and then they bring their wives and children, and then pretty soon, it's all barbarians, right? Calling themselves Romans, or calling themselves whatever. And so this seems to have been what happened. And there are two semi-legendary figures. I say semi-legendary because at least one of them, Hengist, seems to have been a historical individual. And it's not totally clear if he really had a brother named Horsa, or if that's like a doubling, because you often have a brother pair found important places like Romulus and Remus and so on. But they and they're well, not probably, they are Jutes. And so you have Hengist and Horsa, who are Jutes, and the Jutes are the smallest of the three tribes, but it's also clear from like onomastic evidence and things like that in England that they were also the most important of the three tribes. And so they were sort of like small, but basically the aristocrats and the Jutes are from the Jutland Peninsula, which is a very hotly contested piece of land that either belongs to Denmark or to Germany. But Denmark and Germany have not historically agreed on the answer to that question. And they come in and they basically settle in Britain, and over time kind of push the British into what is now called Wales, which is an English word that means foreigners. And of course, the joke here is that only the English could make you feel like a foreigner in your own country. But so what happens here is maybe a little it's similar in certain ways, but also different. So you have these again two semi-legendary brothers, or these two brothers who stand at the end of legend and at the beginning of history, who bring these three tribes in. But obviously, it's a peaceful settlement. There's basically nobody living in what at the what they eventually call the Shire. Basically, nobody living there. So they migrate in, and the king gives them leave to live there, and the only thing they're required to do basically is to maintain the roads. And other than that, they're more or less completely self-governing.
Yeah. And there were roads around, like there were Roman roads, especially.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how blatant is Tolkien's stealing from Hengist and Horsa here, those two brothers?
I don't think it's like totally blatant. I mean,
Well,
certainly the Hengist and Horsa story used to be known much better than it is now. Probably everybody in England grew up with this. I mean, one of the history books we actually use with our kids is was a basically a history textbook of the British Isles that was written in maybe the early 19th century, something like that. It would have been one of the books. If Tolkien didn't grow up with it, he certainly grew up with one like it. And that's basically where the story begins with, here are the giants that lived in the island of Britain before the Trojans came, before Brutus came and killed the giants. And then a little later on, Hengist and Horsa show up. And so that certainly was a story that probably every English person, every British person probably had that in school. I don't know if they still do. I'd rather doubt it, but who knows? They probably had that in school, and so they would have definitely, reading this, I think, would have thought about that.
Sure.
That's speculation.
And I've got the Lord of the Rings Companion, which has a fun note about this. And they just note, Hengist is Old English for gelding, horse, or steed. Horsa stems from Old English horse, which means horse. While Marcho, Tolkien's word for one of these brothers, is derived from the Old English mearch, horse or steed.
Also horse, yeah.
Right. And Blanca is Old English for white or gray.
A white horse.
So for anyone that pays attention at all, Tolkien is totally telegraphing. And this is England.
There are a lot of Old English words for horse, and most of them are color words. It seems like our colors in Old English many of them originally described horses, and then other things by association. So
anyway, let's get into this a little bit here. The actual history of the Shire. Father Andrew, this is a longer nugget, but it has some nice stuff just about the hobbits kind of settling into their.
Yeah. Thus began the Shire reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men and of elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost with the witch lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men record it. But in that war the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the dark plague, Shire Reckoning 37, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of dearth, 1158 to 60, were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. That's interesting to me. Like we think of the Shire as being so hobbity, so much where they are, who they are, where they belong. Like they're the indigenous people or whatever, but they're not. There was, men were there before, apparently. Like the king had all these things going on there, and they took that land and took it over, which, I mean, again, kind of echoes this idea of early English history, where you have this Roman world that is abandoned by the Romans.
Right.
Like there's actually literally like at one point the Roman garrison in England sent a letter back to Rome saying, we've got problems, you
Yeah.
guys.
And Rome basically said, you guys are on your own.
You're on your own. You're
Right.
on your own. That's the end of the Roman
We're
Empire.
rooting for you.
Yeah. Good luck, you guys.
Let us know how it goes.
Right. And that's it. I mean, I think it's Saint Gildas the Wise, actually, I think who records that letter as I recall. I'm actually sitting here. It's great. I have a hand-painted icon of Saint Gildas right here in my studio, which was given to me by a Lithuanian iconographer living in England. So that's fun.
That's amazing. Within the frame, though, I love this paragraph because all of the surprising stuff that we see hobbits doing gets a backstory here. And even though it was a longer reading, this explains why Bilbo has the grounding in the skills that he does. It gives us a backstory and really a resonance for Merry's role in killing the Witch King there. It
Right. I
connects
never thought about that, but you're totally right.
with the hobbits taking up, weapons that are sized for them from the barrow. It's like this resumption of their role. That when the hobbits arrive in Gondor, they are as much a remnant of the lost realm of Arnor as the Rangers when they come with Aragorn. But the hobbits get first.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, right, like that the impression of what hobbits are, what their culture is, and so forth, like in this present in the moment of these stories, you get the sense like they're just fat and stupid, and then there's these really exceptional people among them, like Bilbo and Frodo and his friends. And yet there is this back history. There is this story, like they were warriors.
Yeah.
They were pioneers. They were settlers. Like they had some strength in them.
Yeah. They sent archers to the last battle at Fornost,
So they say.
Although no tale of men remembers it.
Because none of them came home. Like, okay, there's some epic stuff hiding in there.
Yeah.
So, Richard, would you read a little bit about the Elven connection here for the Shire? And I'm really excited about this because I think I'm seeing something that I hadn't noticed before. Please go ahead.
So 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills. Very practical Anglo-Saxon naming convention there, by the way. Were still to be seen on the Tower Hills beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green mound. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them. And the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death. And they turned their faces away from the hills in the west.
So I wrote some stuff about this because if you read like in the Book of Lost Tales, and you see how Tolkien is beginning all this stuff, his legendarium really grows, especially his love for the land grows out of this really deep, strong love for the places where he spent time with Edith, with his wife, before and after their marriage. And there's one place, and I don't know if either of you have this book, the Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien.
I do.
John Garth. This is a beautiful book. He's got like photos of the English countryside, but these are 3 effectively bits of heraldry that he put together for 3 places that were important to him and Edith. There's Edith, right, and him. But the middle one is the crest for what he called Cortirion, which is Warwick. And you see this white tower there. And Cortirion shows up time and again, and it ends up because his original idea is that England is Tol Eressëa. It is the island of the elves, and then they left it and went somewhere else. And he abandons that whole idea fairly early on, and eventually Tol Eressëa is of course the island that gets by on which they are ferried across to Valinor. But I think there's still remnants of this idea here. And also, he connects this idea of a tower from which you can see the sea, and that's an analogy that shows up very prominently in Monsters and the Critics. And
Yeah.
if either of you want to snag that, so I don't.
Yeah, if you read Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which is this famous lecture that he gave, in which he basically said, look, we need to take Beowulf seriously as a piece of literature and not just as an anthropological text to be mined for details about Anglo-Saxon society. He has this bit about, taking apart a tower, and destroying the thing that it was for, right? Yeah, it's a great essay, although difficult to read because there's all these like untranslated bits in there. He just sort of assumes Latin and Greek and Old English and whatever, as one does. But the thing I like about this passage, and it's actually a little maddening for me, is like the Tower Hills. Nothing, I think, in the Legendarium ever happens there. Like, it's referenced, but we never get to go there.
Yeah.
And the thing that immediately comes to mind in terms of an image for me as to what this must be like a little bit is Glastonbury Tor, which I actually got to go there this past summer to Glastonbury Tor. And probably everybody's seen a picture of this. There's this high green hill, and there's this one tower on top of it. The Tor, Glastonbury Tor, is the hill. Actually, it's not the tower. The tower is on top of the Tor. And it's actually said that that King Arthur is buried there, that the Holy Grail is buried there.
Which is incorrect, by the way. Everyone knows King Arthur is on Venus. But anyway, continue. Sorry, that's a different author.
Yeah, there's so many places that he might be. Is England Avalon, or is Avalon Ireland? I don't know.
Is Tol Eressëa Avalon, which
right, exactly.
Yes. The whole thing is all wrapped
Clearly,
together.
the answer to all those questions is yes. It's all true. But
all true.
The tower that's on top of Glastonbury Tor is actually the remains of a church. It's the last bit of the remains of a much larger building, and it had two towers on the front, and only one survives. And so that's all that's there is this tower. And what's one of the things that's interesting about it is it has no roof. And so when you go in there, you look straight up and there's the sky. And maybe it had a roof at some point in history, but it doesn't now, that's for sure. And the wind is almost always really blowing. And when I went up there this summer, the wind was blowing and it started to rain. And so, you can't exactly go in there and be sheltered from it. But what was really fascinating is there's a door in the front and the back of the tower, and the roof is open. And so then as the wind blasts through it, it creates a sort of wind tunnel. And so you're in there and it's almost like you're in like this other kind of world,
Wow.
You're between worlds. And it's called St. Michael's Tower because that was the name of the church. And appropriately, St. Michael, of course, is kind of this Lord of the Winds and angelic lore and all this kind of stuff. So in any event, like when I think of the Tower Hills, that I now am sort of experiencing Glastonbury Tor again and St. Michael's Tower. And I think of it as this place that's connected with elves, right? This otherworldly thing. But I wish we got to go there to see what's there. I guess the closest we get is, in some ways, is Amon Sûl, even though that's actually a tower that was built by
Burned
men.
and broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, burned and broken. Yeah.
And so, Richard, moving forward here, we'll leave the rest of the concerning hobbits for those who want to learn more of Tolkien's fun retrospective, plenty of spoilers, his whole thing. But he moves on to a new section of the prologue here concerning pipeweed, and I think you have stuff to share with us on this, Richard.
This is, to me, the most I mean, if I was Tolkien's editor and he submitted this manuscript to me for publication, I would look at this section and be like, what does this have to do with anything? Okay.
Well, because he knew
Like,
that someday there would be a movie
right.
made by a man named Peter Jackson where someone would say, where Bilbo Baggins would say, the finest weed in the South Farthing,
Right.
and then
And
all the
that does,
stoners in the back will giggle.
it does require a little bit of clarification. All right. So Tolkien does say that concerning pipeweed, there is another astonishing thing about the hobbits of old that must be mentioned. An astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clay or wood, the smoke of the burning leaves of an herb which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. Nicotiana is the Latin name for tobacco. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this peculiar custom or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. And then he gives us a nice little introduction to where did the leaf probably come from. So this is one of those things. It's actually a good example of the troubling case of nightshades in The Lord of the Rings. So there are multiple nightshades. Nightshade being a class of plant mentioned. These are New World plants. They are not native to Europe, such as
Tomatoes.
tobacco, tomatoes, and of course, taters. Um, you're welcome.
Boil them, mash them,
Boil and mash them, stick them in a stew, right? So those are all nightshades. They are not native to Europe. Obviously, it would be very difficult to even notice that the potato is not native to Europe, or the tomato for that matter. They're
That's
completely
true.
ubiquitous. There are certain things in the New World that once they reached Europe, even very traditional societies were like, "Oh, we want that," and
Yeah,
the pipe was one of those things.
this is what we've been waiting for.
That's right. So tobacco was something that's very dear to Tolkien. Now, as we kind of discussed, I have basically restrained myself for years from talking too much about this because I know that like in the real world in your physical embodied life, right, smoking is a very it's a very controversial thing. Obviously, especially smoking cigarettes can be really, really detrimental to your health. I don't think anybody's arguing that. Um, Tolkien smoked a pipe his entire life. He smoked a pipe more or less constantly. And even when he did not smoke his pipe, he had his pipe in his mouth like this. And so Tolkien, who had a bit of a speech impediment, would very often teach with his pipe clenched between his teeth like this. So, and between his speech impediment and the fact that he had kind of like a low, quiet voice, and it was sort of mumble everything, and the fact that he has a pipe in his mouth basically meant that it was very difficult for people to understand him very often. We get there's a description by Alida Becker. She says that I remember sitting in his study, which was the converted garage of his house in Sandfield Road. By the way, Tolkien's study where he did most of his work, converted garage. I just really love that. Um, in Sandfield Road, Oxford, and I was listening to Tolkien, creator and first inhabitant of that beneficently enchanting world of Middle Earth. He was wandering up and down, endlessly striking matches to light the pipe he was never without, and talking through it, round it, and sometimes to it, and to me, and frequently over my head about that long-awaited next book. So this is basically how Tolkien talked. And if you smoke a pipe, so I would just say I do smoke a pipe, not every day, but probably more or less once a week. I find it to be a very helpful, beneficial thing, especially for being able to sort of think. For people who don't know, um, there's a huge difference between cigarettes and pipe smoking, both in what you're smoking and also in the kind of the culture that's around it. And so a lot of times, pipe smoking requires it is actually an art. It is an art that requires a certain degree of skill to do well. You'll know this if you've never smoked a pipe before and then you try it, or you try it for the first time after a long time and you just can't get the thing to go. Right. So it is something that requires a bit of an art, a bit of and it has its own little, let's say, ritual aspect to it between the lighting, the puffing, and the tamping. And if you're able to blowing smoke rings, all those things. Tolkien's entire work is completely shot through with this. In fact, there would be no Lord of the Rings if Bilbo had not been searching for his pipe in his pocket, looking around, trying to find his pipe. Can't. Oh, what's he pull out? He pulls out this ring that he picked up, and he puts it on. Right. So the whole of Tolkien's Legendarium is shot through with this, and of course, there's a lot of meditation on pipeweed and the social role that it has in the Lord of the Rings. Basically, the ability for friends to like sit around, smoke a pipe. There's one of my favorite chapters in the whole book, Flotsam and Jetsam, is basically based around this. Guys, we found some tobacco, and now we get to sit around and we get to smoke, and we haven't done this in months, and it's going to be this wonderful kind of relief for everybody. This was an important part of Tolkien's friendship, but even when Tolkien started smoking a pipe, it was a deliberately old-fashioned choice, because even at this point, pipes were pretty, like old-fashioned things. And now it's basically something you do if you're just a certain kind of person. Very often the sort of person who will also have a Tolkien podcast, as it happens. But in Tolkien's day, most people smoked cigarettes. Tolkien didn't like cigarettes, did not smoke cigarettes, but he smoked a pipe more or less incessantly. Lewis smoked cigarettes basically all the time. But Tolkien smoked his pipe, and part of the reason he smoked the pipe was this intentional, I think, choice to be this kind of certain kind of person, as a nod to this earlier English country life. And so his legal guardian after the death of his mother, Father Francis Morgan, smoked a pipe. He had this long-stemmed, Tolkien describes it as this long-stemmed cherry wood pipe, and Tolkien decided to smoke a pipe because he would see Father Morgan sitting out on the porch smoking this long-stemmed cherry pipe. One can imagine it's had a sort of maybe a Gandalfian quality to it. And so for Tolkien, it became, kind of a ubiquitous part of a certain kind of life, which had to do with something like a slow, quiet, meditative country life, a part of the vanishing English countryside, whereas the, like cigarettes and things like that coming in are basically a function of, especially the mass production of cigarettes with all the things that were and are still put into them, the tar and everything else is kind of a, the modern impulse to say, how can I turn this into the most addictive, consumer friendly product possible so that more and more people will buy it, right? And so for Tolkien, the pipe was, so even when he wasn't smoking it, he had it with him. The other thing that you'll realize if you do smoke a pipe is that the pipe becomes an incredibly useful prop. You can point it at people. Lewis said it gives a wise man time to between his thoughts, and for a foolish man, it's something to put in his mouth and shut him up. So it's just a generally useful kind of a prop. And certainly a big part of the Legendarium. By the way, so is beer, right? So is beer, so are other things like this, all of these things which in the wrong quantities are not particularly good for you. But for Tolkien, they're an important part of what it meant to live basically the kind of life that to the point that it's not just like the hobbits who enjoy it. Aragorn likes a pipe, Gandalf likes a pipe, right?
Smoking
and
angels.
actually finds it really necessary. Yeah, right. Actually finds it really necessary for him to like sort of like clear his head and be able to think about where to go next and what to do next. So anyway, that's an apologia. I'm not saying go out and start smoking a pipe or anything like that, but this is one of those things. If you're going to read The Lord of the Rings, you will need to come to terms with the fact that there is smoking and drinking. And actually, as a young Baptist, these were the most controversial parts of the book. So there you go.
Sure. And it is maybe worth noting that whatever one ends up doing with these things, the way that they function in the Lord of the Rings is important, because it's not a matter of consumption, it's not a matter of excess, it's not a matter even of the effect that the stuff has on you, but it's a matter of sobriety, of seriousness, of silence, of thoughtfulness, and very, very often of conviviality, of fellowship. Someone who is smoking a pipe invites, just by virtue of doing it, someone else to come and join them, to not bum us share in the tobacco, to sit and talk and take time to be together.
And you
Which,
don't take when you smoke a pipe, it is not a let me go take a quick cigarette break. It's a I'm going to commit the next 45 minutes to an hour
yeah,
to this action. And it really does. I mean, I will just say sometimes when I'm really struggling with a work problem that I can't figure out, I will step outside, pace back and forth in the yard, smoke a pipe, and usually by the time the pipe is done, I know the answer to the problem. Which is a very, Gandalf does that sort of thing as well, and it does work that way. But yeah, I think conviviality is an important word. You could say a good English word for this is to be merry, right? To be which is not just joyful or mirthful or something like this, but it's just a kind of pervasive mood. It's the celadreamas. It's the hall joys, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, nobody was smoking tobacco in Beowulf, but if they could have, they would have, right? It's part of that. It's part of that life together with other people, enjoying the good things of the earth, hopefully in sober quantities. But yeah, and that's a really important part of what the Lord of the Rings is about.
effectively enjoying the good things of the creator without using them,
Right.
and preferring
Right.
the creation to the creator.
Right. It's wine to gladden the heart of man, right? And make his face cheerful with oil. And then also, again, no tobacco when David wrote that psalm, but
Very good.
yeah.
So, Richard, as we move on, I want to thank you for your reflections on pipeweed and what it means there to Tolkien.
Don't
Uh,
smoke, kids. Don't smoke.
but
I just have to say that as an employee of H.
don't smoke, but look for the opportunities for quiet and conviviality and fellowship that Tolkien found in his pipe smoking and other things.
Yeah.
And address all complaints, please, to Richard Rohlin.
Ah!
It's all right. Come at me. Let's go.
At me, bro. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I was gonna say, I think the important takeaway from this, right, is not like, is it good or bad to smoke? But no, like, how does this function within the
Right.
story
That's
as a
right.
story
That's right.
element?
That's right.
That's the point. That's really.
That's right.
exactly. And then you understand what it means when Tolkien is presented, waving his pipe there in the
Right.
photo.
Yeah.
So I think we can leave the rest of the pipeweed and the description even of the Shire and the police force there for everyone to read. I mean, we don't have to go through every single bit of this.
As fun as that would be.
But no one wants to listen to 5 hours of podcast, right?
4 hours, maybe.
For suffice to say, there were a total of like 12 policemen in the entirety of the Shire, which is amazing. And they
great.
called them sheriffs, and then there were bounders because things were getting, troubled, and then we'll move on. The next bit, Tolkien provides a summary of the finding of the ring, which lets us know that this is important. And it's called Of the Finding of the Ring. But what we might not recognize is that there are, in fact, two versions of the ring story. And almost all of us in the present day have only ever seen the later one, the one that came from the Lord of the Rings. But in fact, that is not what the original publication, which looked like this, actually had. The original publication had the story, had a different story, and we're going to talk about that. So I'll read this little bit because it talks about how Bilbo actually found the ring, how he got it from Gollum, how he, stumbled upon it, put it in his pocket. Gollum chased him out. But Tolkien says, now it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them, his account was that Gollum had promised to give him a present if he won the game, but when Gollum went to fetch it from his island, he found the treasure was gone, a magic ring which had been given to him long ago on his birthday. Bilbo guessed this was the very ring he had found, and as he had won the game, it was already his by right, so why say anything about it? And then Tolkien says, this account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts. But many copies contain the true account as an alternative, derived no doubt from notes by Frodo or Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old Hobbit himself. So this is kind of amazing. And what Tolkien is dealing with is the fact that there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many thousands of copies of The Hobbit floating around from those first editions, which have a story which contradicts the entire background of The Lord of the Rings as it developed. So he had to update it. And most of us now live with the updated version.
Yeah. And I imagine it's a bit of a bootleg of some kind, but if you do your Googling right, you can actually find side-by-side comparisons of that whole chapter, Riddles in the Dark from The Hobbit, on the web, where you can actually see all the changes that he made. And of course, this is the key one, but there's lots of other revisions and so forth that were made years later, frankly.
By the way, by the time Lord of the Rings is published, there have been 4 impressions of The Hobbit printed. There's the first impression, which is only 1,500 copies, and the second impression, which had more color illustrations by Tolkien. The third impression, which only had 1 color illustrations because it was right in the middle. I think it was 1942, and they had to basically cut back because of the war. And then the fourth impression, which is published in 1946, had 4,000 copies printed. So there's these different impressions. So, but these are not like insane numbers.
No.
Each time.
Yeah,
they're
that's
not
a lot
crazy
less
numbers.
than I expected.
So kids, if you find yourself a 1937 first impression of one of those,
you need to immediately send it to me. So I can keep it.
There are a lot more publications of the facsimile version, which
then there were right. Yeah. If you find the original one, you might be able to retire, folks, or at least take a couple months off of work.
I think a first edition sold for, how much was it recently? Boy, it was tens of thousands of dollars at least.
A lot of money.
I think more.
Yeah. Like this is not like finding, the first folio or something like that from Shakespeare where you really could retire.
Or like an original copy of the Iliad in that one J-Lo movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is interesting because for lots of reasons, but the original story, of course, is much more benign. And Gollum is frankly a more whimsical, weird creature living in the dark kind of thing. He's not this pivotal figure in the original version. So not only is the story of the Finding of the Ring different, but Gollum's character changes. He's much darker and more sinister, and more dangerous in the
retcon.
In the retcon.
$210,000, by the way. That's what the last one sold for.
Wow. Gollum's not creepy. He's more just kind of sad. Father Andrew, would you read that passage from the original version? It starts both wrong, because the characterization of Gollum you get there is really striking compared to what everyone recognizes from the movies.
So listen to this, everybody. I mean, so they're in the middle of the riddle game, right? Both wrong, cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword.
This is after Gollum says, "Straight or thing."
Yeah. But funnily enough, he need not have been alarmed. For one thing, Gollum had learned long, long ago was never, never to cheat at the riddle game, which is a sacred one and of immense antiquity. Also, there was the sword. He simply sat and whispered. What about the present? Asked Bilbo, not that he cared very much. But still, he felt that he had won it pretty fairly and in very difficult circumstances, too. Must we give it the thing, precious? Yes, we must. It's just hard to do anything but Andy Serkis.
We're all doing
Andy Serkis. I know.
Everyone has to have
a although like when the Rankin Bass Gollum was much bassier and we must fetch it, precious, and
but
I think we promised.
I think Andy Serkis was doing Rob Inglis. I think he's the real origin of the Gollum voice. So
Gollum paddled back to his boat, and Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him, but he had not. The hobbit was just thinking of going back up the passage, having had quite enough of Gollum and the dark water's edge, when he heard him wailing and squeaking away in the gloom. He was on his island, of which, of course, Bilbo knew nothing, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain, and turning out his pockets. "Where is it? Where is it?" Bilbo heard him speaking. "Lost, lost, my precious, lost, lost! Bless us and splash us. We haven't the present we promised, and we haven't even got it for ourselves." Bilbo turned round and waited, wondering what it could be that the creature was making such a fuss about. This proved very fortunate afterwards. For Gollum came back and made a tremendous spluttering and whispering and croaking, and in the end Bilbo gathered that Gollum had had a ring, a wonderful, beautiful ring, a ring that he had been given for a birthday present ages and ages before in the old days when such rings were less uncommon. Sometimes he had it in his pocket. Usually he kept it in a little hole in the rock on his island. Sometimes he wore it when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish and crept along dark passages looking for stray goblins. Then he might even venture into places where the torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh, yes, very nearly safe. For if you slipped that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Only in the sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that was a faint and shaky sort of shadow. I don't know how many times Gollum begged Bilbo's pardon. He kept on saying, "We are sorry. We didn't mean to cheat. We meant to give it our only present if it won the competition." He even offered to catch Bilbo some nice juicy fish to eat as a consolation. Bilbo shuddered at the thought of it. "No, thank you," he said, as politely as he could. He was thinking hard, and the idea came to him that Gollum must have dropped that ring sometime, and that he must have found it, and that he had had that very ring in his pocket. But he had the wits not to tell Gollum. "Finding's keeping," he said to himself, and being in a very tight place, I dare say he was right. Anyway, the ring belonged to him now. "Never mind," he said. "The ring would have been mine now if you had found it, so you would have lost it anyway, and I will let you off on one condition." "Yes, what is it? What does it wish us to do, my precious?" "Help me to get out of these places," said Bilbo. Now Gollum had agreed to this if he was not to cheat. Had to agree to this if he was not to cheat. He still very much wanted just to try what the stranger tasted like, but now he had to give up all the idea of it. Still, there was the little sword, and the stranger was wide awake and on the lookout, not unsuspecting, as Gollum liked to have things which he attacked. So perhaps it was best, after all. Yeah, that's quite different. Although it's interesting, though, that even though Gollum is like committed to not cheating,
he really, really wants to eat him.
He kind of, yeah, he's like, but, well, there's the sword. Okay, there's the sword.
And we promised. But
right.
I find it fascinating how much of what ultimately shows up is still kind of like there's a lot that Tolkien can work with in doing the retcon, especially the casual way it says at the beginning. What about the present? Not that he cared very much. Still, he felt he'd won it, and pretty fairly in difficult
difficult circumstances.
It's like I didn't. It's like you can almost hear him like telling the story, and like, and it wasn't important, and it wasn't a big deal. I didn't really want it at all, but I figured I did want it, and I should like hold my own. You can almost see that insidious influence that
justification
really teases out later on. It's
and also what you get in this is Gollum's lie.
Yeah.
Later we know it's a lie, right? But in this version, so not only is it a retcon of how Bilbo got the ring, it's also a retcon of how Gollum got the ring.
Right.
Because here it says that it simply says that he got it as a birthday present long ago. It just simply says that. It doesn't say, but actually Gollum killed someone for it.
Right.
So it's interesting. There's this another layer of retconning going on there as well.
But the way he retells it in the introduction here in the prologue, the retcon makes Gollum more sinister and kind of doesn't tell us yet that Gollum killed for it. We get that a couple chapters in, but we're prepped for it. If we've only ever heard the original story, we're like, whoa, wait a minute, Bilbo lied, and Gandalf took that seriously and thought it was strange. And what's with the lie? And what is this thing doing?
So something to also notice here is that the lie about the birthday present is actually two layers of a lie. There's Smeagol wants it as his present, as a birthday present, and that's why he feels like he's entitled to it, because he wants the ring and he uses that as the justification. And then Bilbo says that basically Bilbo's lie about the present part was suggested by Gollum calling it his birthday present, right? And so again, it's that those multiple layers of deception actually.
Yeah.
Right. And
And then
Richard,
it actually is a birthday present to Frodo, which is the ironic thing.
that's really cool. Richard, would you read from earlier in the script there? It's in the orange where it stars. It says, the idea of a present was not mere Hobbit-like invention, because effectively that's Tolkien saying.
Yeah, where is that?
Yeah, this is from the prologues
Yeah, the idea of
retconning.
a present, yeah, the idea of a present was not mere Hobbit-like invention all the same. It was suggested to Bilbo, as he confessed, by Gollum's talk that he overheard. For Gollum did in fact call the ring his birthday present many times. That also Gandalf thought strange and suspicious, but he did not discover the truth in this point for many more years, as will be seen in this book. So yeah, Frodo is the only person who's actually ever received the ring as a genuine birthday present.
Yeah. But brilliant what Tolkien
Yeah.
manages to do. He told the story he wanted to tell, and like how much it's amazing how little actually has to be changed in Riddles in the Dark to make this work.
It's difficult to overstate the importance of this retcon, I think, because it basically makes the Lord of the Rings work. Like it sets up everything, especially the destruction of the ring, the taming of Smeagol, everything that else comes down the line, right? Basically stems out of this retcon.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and the ring itself becomes a very different thing through the retcon.
Yeah.
Right. In the original Hobbit, it's an invisibility ring that helps you catch goblins in the dark, and that's nice,
And it helps you, trash talk spiders,
Exactly. Yeah, even in the
meals from
retcon,
the
yeah,
Elven King's halls.
yeah, even in the retcon, even in the revised version of the
Right.
Hobbit, the ring, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, it's important to have an invisibility ring, but it's not this sinister, super dark thing. But when you get the retcon, then you get the question of why would Bilbo lie?
Yeah.
And it's really because the ring has started to work on him to make
Yeah.
him want to possess it, you know?
And the extent to which, as readers, just going through the prologue, if we don't skip it, we're already primed to then be questioning and wondering and recognizing the sinisterness of this. It really sets up beautifully that scene in the hallway and at Bag End when Bilbo doesn't want to let it go. So
Yeah.
it's nicely done. I have again the companion here, and the fun thing is that Tolkien almost didn't actually mean to do this. So let me read from this. So as Tolkien worked on the Lord of the Rings, he developed a very different view of the ring. Now it was to possess its bearer too strongly for it to be given up easily. So on July 31st, 1947, he wrote to Stanley Unwin in response to comments by Rayner Unwin. He says, Rayner has, of course, spotted a weakness inevitable, the linking between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The weakness is Gollum and his action in offering the ring as a present. That's in the letters, page 121, I guess. But on September 21st, so a couple of months later, Tolkien sent a specimen of the rewriting of Chapter 5, which would simplify but not necessarily improve my present task. This revision altered Gollum's promise and made Gollum more wretched and treacherous. Tolkien then seemed to forget about this revision. He just sort of sent it as, you could do this. And then 3 years later, after a gap, it says, not atypical of the post-war days of paper rationing, when he received proof of a new edition of The Hobbit, including his specimen. So then he wrote to Stanley Unwin on September 10th, 1950, well, there it is. The alteration is now made, and cannot, I suppose, be unmade.
Wow.
I have now in my hands two printed versions of a crucial incident. Either the first must be regarded as washed out, a mere wrist writing that ought never to have seen the light, or the story as a whole must take into account the existence of two versions and use it. The former was my original simple-minded intention, though it is a bit awkward since The Hobbit is fairly widely known in its older form. If the literary process can be done convincingly, I think, but not briefly explained in a note. So he's like, can we please not publish this? I was going to be fine with it. And then 2 weeks later, on September 14th, he writes again, I have decided to accept the existence of both versions of Chapter 5, so far as the sequel goes. and then he does the retcon that we
I
read.
like how he says, I've decided to accept the existence. Like, I'm gonna work that into my general vocabulary of things about things that I don't like. I have decided to accept the existence of this thing. Just, I'll allow it now to exist. It's
I
good.
have decided to accept the existence of the American electoral form of government. Although I am thinking about painting the doorposts of my home with blood,
With a little bit of blood just in case.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
just in case. Yeah, I mean, but I think it's worth noting here, right? Okay, so The Hobbit is published in 1937 with the original version. 10 years later, he writes the alternative version of Riddles in the Dark.
And forgets about it.
And forgets about it. 3 years after that, it's actually published. So from 1937 to 1950, what the public is reading is the original version. And then in 1950, everything printed after that point has the retconned version. And then what is it? In 1956 or 1954, Fellowship of the Ring comes out.
Yeah.
And he's, of course, concerned, like, well, look, everybody knows the original version. Like, this is going to be weird, whatever. But here we are 74 years later, and almost no one even knows, except for the nerds, right? People like us. No one even knows that there is another version of this turning point in the Legendarium.
Now, I have to mention that we're not talking about the retcon I thought we would have talked about today. Since we focused on the curious case of nightshades in Middle Earth.
No.
Because one of the other things that is retconned in the second edition of The Hobbit is that references to tomatoes are changed to pickles.
Oh.
So that's a retconning, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really obviously the more important retcon.
Obviously. I mean, yeah, I mostly read these books for the food. I think that should be obvious,
And I do endorse pickles, kids. Kids, go out and eat pickles. It's good
Go
for
eat
you.
pickles.
It's good for your digestion, especially ones that are naturally fermented and not just soaked in vinegar.
I think that this retcon is actually a proof of time travel, because what it means is that someone took the Peter Jackson movies back and showed them to Tolkien, and when he saw the scene of Denethor eating tomatoes, he was like, "We gotta nip this in the."
I laughed too hard at that. That is so
Wow.
delightful. Yeah. I think we all basically, everybody of a certain age just has like cherry tomato based trauma. Oh my gosh.
I have to say, though, that is it John Noble? Is that his name?
John Noble, yeah.
That is one of the best pieces of casting, in my opinion.
John Noble, so listen, I love almost all the casting for the Peter Jackson trilogy.
Yeah.
Like there are creative decisions which I will still quibble with, but I love almost all the casting. I mean, John Noble. I mean, I think that Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn was a really inspired choice, and I literally can't watch him in anything else since then. Because it's like, what are you doing, Aragorn? Stop it! What are you doing?
Has he done other things since then?
I have to quibble with you on that, though. I really think if they'd stuck with Stuart Townsend, it would have been a much better movie.
Wow.
I'm teasing.
Okay, I was like,
I'm like, man,
I don't want to call you out on your own show now.
Down.
No, so Viggo's done a bunch of like weird little art projects since then, but the other two movies of his that are quite good are, of course, Hidalgo, and then there's a Spanish language one about the 30 Years' War. I think it's called Alto Triste.
But Hidalgo is a great movie.
But Alto Triste has the actual best sword fights in any movie that have ever been made. They're very accurate sword fights, which is actually quite hard to come by in film. So anyway, yeah. All my sword appreciators out there, you guys know who you are. I don't even have to tell you that because you've already seen the movie, probably yesterday.
I remember you did like a thread over a course of a week where you shared like all of your favorite movie fight scenes. That was an interesting thread you did.
Wow. This has been like a million years since I did that thread. I'm impressed that I think I did that during COVID or something because I was just watching it. Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it at all until you mentioned that. I was like, oh yeah, I remember.
Father Anthony is a hipster Rohlin fan.
That's apparently the deep lore right there. I mean, I am a long, lifelong martial artist, fencer. And I really enjoy like good fights in movies. And And definitely like Alta Triste has some of the, it's probably not the right name. I can't remember what the movie's called now. But anyway, it's the one, it's the Spanish language film Viggo Mortensen made about the 30 Years' War. You guys should be able to Google that. So,
Sure.
yeah.
And then I think we can wrap up with the final summary of The Hobbit. Father Andrew, would you read just the last thing on setting the stage for where we begin?
Yeah. Okay.
Alla Triste. I was that. Yeah, it was pretty close. Okay, sorry.
You know,
It's gonna bother me.
now we can look it up.
Yeah.
This account of the end of the Third Age is drawn mainly from the Red Book of Westmarch. That most important source for the history of the War of the Ring was so called because it was long preserved at Under Towers. I love that name. Under Towers, the home of the Fairbairns, wardens of the Westmarch. It was in origin Bilbo's private diary, which he took with him to Rivendell. Frodo brought it back to the Shire, together with many loose leaves of notes. And during Shire Reckoning 1420, he nearly filled its 1420 to 1421, he nearly filled its pages with his account of the war. But annexed to it and preserved with it, probably in a single red case, were the 3 large volumes bound in red leather that Bilbo gave to him as a parting gift. To these 4 volumes there was added in Westmarch a 5th, containing commentaries, genealogies, and various other matter concerning the Hobbit members of the Fellowship.
All right, Richard, can you break this down for us? What are the different pieces that he's talking about here?
Sure.
What's he doing?
Yeah. So the manuscript conceit for the Lord of the Rings, and actually for Tolkien's Legendarium, actually, is that it's all the Red Book of Western March, of which Tolkien himself is the translator. And essentially, you have Bilbo's private diary, which is The Hobbit. Frodo brings that back to the Shire, together with, it says, many loose leaves of notes, which are the basis of the Silmarillion. So the Silmarillion, the frame narrative for the Silmarillion is essentially
are the loose leaves the basis for the Silmarillion, or like Bilbo's attempts to start the Lord of the Rings? Because I thought the 3
no, because you have the many loose
were...
leaves of notes, which is basically Bilbo's notes on the translations from the Elvish that he'll mention a little bit later on. But then it says together with many loose leaves of notes, and during SR 1420 to 21, he nearly filled his pages with his account of the war. So that is Frodo filled its pages with his account of the war, but he annexed to it and preserved with it, probably in a single red case, were the 3 large volumes bound in red leather that Bilbo gave him as a parting gift. Does anybody have that passage right now? Because basically, this is Bilbo's account of the story of the War of the Ring as the Hobbits told him about it when they came back to Rivendell.
Right, and it's on the next page. I should have put this
Oh, okay. Yeah.
On page 15, at least in 1 here.
Yeah, can you read that part real quick where Bilbo gives him the books?
Right. Well, I don't have the books itself.
Okay. That's all right. So
from the note on the Shire records, it says the chief importance of Finnegal's copy is it alone contains the whole of Bilbo's translations from the Elvish. These 3 volumes were found to be a work of great skill and learning.
Right. Yeah. So that's, yeah, you were right. I'm sorry. So the 3 volumes, those are the Silmarillion.
Right.
And if you look at the general division of the Silmarillion, now they're not equal divisions, but you would have like the Anulindale, and then the Quenta Silmarillion, and then the Akalabeth of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. Those are basically the 3 different books. Now, are those the 3 books that Bilbo had in mind, or were the 3 books supposed to be like the 3 great tales, or nobody knows? It's kind of like the Old Testament canon. Everyone knows there's 24 books of the Old Testament, but it's what exactly those 24 books contain and what order they might be arranged in is sort of anybody's guess at any given time. Right. So this is made into at least a couple of copies. The first is kept in the Shire for the descendants of the children of Master Samwise. The most important copy, however, is kept at Great Smeals, but it was written in Gondor, probably at the request of the great grandson of Peregrine and completed in Shire reckoning 1592. Its
Yeah.
southern scribe appended this note. Findegal, king's writer, finished this work in the fourth age, the year 172. It is an exact copy in all details of the Thane's book in Minas Tirith. That book was a copy, made at the request of King Elisar, of the Red Book of the Perineth, and was brought to him by the Thane Peregrine when he returned to Gondor in the year 64 of the fourth age. The Thane's book was thus the first copy made of the Red Book and contained much that was later omitted or lost. In Minas Tirith, it received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages. So if you actually pay attention to this, there were already two separate manuscript traditions, one of which, because one manuscript stays in the Shire and then has its redactions. The other manuscript goes to Gondor, is copied there. They make additions and corrections. That is then copied and eventually brought back to the Shire at Great Smeals. So you actually would have had in the fourth age two extant copies of the Red Book in the Shire that would represent basically two different manuscript traditions. And I think that this is one of the ways that you can kind of account for certain hobbity incongruities, and then certain parts that seem to have not been written by hobbits. Some of the additions and corrections in Gondor are very clear, especially when you get to the Two Towers and the Return of the King, because it will say, it was sung, later by, a
A
Shob,
bard in Gondor.
a bard of Rohan, or a poet of Gondor, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're not to necessarily imagine that Frodo wrote in every single song. He probably remembered the Hobbit songs and he remembered the ones that he was present for. But there's definitely plenty of the songs in there that somebody else said, oh, the song about the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, it went like this, and then somebody added that in as part of a redaction.
Yeah.
And so
I don't
yeah,
know
and
if I could read everything I kind of had highlighted as interesting, but
yeah, just the other thing that I'll mention is that there are basically, this is where we also get the origin of where the different appendices came from and so on. And also the materials which become the published Silmarillion. So yeah, it's I mean it would be a fun, completely foolish project to try to take the text of everything and which more or less is what you have in the history of Middle Earth, but you could select from it and try to put together the real text of the Red Book of Western March.
the Frodo Project.
Which would be like, it would be like trying to hunt down Q source and be like, well, which part of this stuff was really written by hobbits, and then which part of the stuff was later written by men of Gondor. And the crazy thing is that Tolkien's range, even his vocabulary and syntax, is so varied based on who is supposed to have written this part of the text that you can do lexomic analysis and it looks like it's different people writing.
It's so
and that is pretty insane to me.
Yeah. I mean, that's, like anyone who's ever done any writing of fiction and has Tolkien living in their head, there's a part of you that's like, man, I want to do what he's doing. And then there's a part of you that when you realize
that would be insane,
the level of complexity of what he's done, you just never want to write anything ever again.
Just throw up your hands and give up. Why bother?
Exactly.
So Terry Pratchett is an English fantasy author and satirist, wrote some really fun books, but he said something like Tolkien's like Mount Fiji, like he's always just looming there in the background until you're finally standing on top of him, and then you can't see Mount Fiji, you can just see everything else, right? Which is sort of like Tolkien's works being the tower from which you can see the sea. Yeah, something like that.
That's a nice way to wrap up. We could talk about a ton more, but I think for the sake of everyone else's lives and ours too, we should move on. So that brings us to our fourth act. We all love reading Tolkien, and the books are the most important thing, not the movies, not even podcasts. So it's always interesting to hear how people interpret reading them out loud. Father Andrew, you haven't gotten the chance to read aloud from Tolkien very much at all if ever, in hosting this. So why don't you take a chance to pick a favorite passage and read it to us?
Yeah, I've done it. I think I've done it once or twice when I was sort of on Richard's side of the podcast, and he's like, "Father, why don't you go ahead and take the chance here?" So the passage that I've selected is one that I think has been read at least once or twice by other people, but I wanted to do this because I felt that for our 111st episode, uh, this is the one that I wanted to kind of go out with. Not to say, God willing, that we won't be back if you're willing to invite us back sometime.
Anytime,
So,
anytime, say the word.
um, but I haven't done this one before on the podcast that I can recall. It's hard to remember after 111 episodes. Um, yeah, so this is from the end. Then Elrond and Galadriel rode on, for the third age was over, and the days of the rings were past, and an end was come of the story and song of those times. With them went many elves of the high kindred, who would no longer stay in Middle-earth, and among them, filled with a sadness that was yet blessed and without bitterness, rode Sam and Frodo and Bilbo, and the elves delighted to honor them. Though they rode through the midst of the Shire all the evening and all the night, none saw them pass save the wild creatures. Or here and there some wanderer in the dark who saw a swift shimmer under the trees, or a light and shadow flowing through the grass as the moon went westward. And when they had passed from the Shire, going about the south skirts of the White Downs, they came to the far downs and to the towers, and looked on the distant sea. And so they rode down at last to Mithlond, to the grey havens in the long firth of Lune. As they came to the gates, Círdan the shipwright came forth to greet them. Very tall he was, and his beard was long, and he was grey and old, save that his eyes were keen as stars. And he looked at them and bowed and said, "All is now ready." Then Círdan led them to the havens, and there was a white ship lying, and upon the quay beside a great grey horse stood a figure robed all in white awaiting them. As he turned and came towards them, Frodo saw that Gandalf now wore openly on his hand the third ring, Narya the Great, and the stone upon it was red as fire. Then those who were to go were glad, for they knew that Gandalf also would take ship with them. But Sam was now sorrowful at heart, and it seemed to him that if the parting would be bitter, more grievous still would be the long road home alone. But even as they stood there, and the elves were going aboard, and all was being made ready to depart, up rode Merry and Pippin in great haste. And amid his tears, Pippin laughed. "You tried to give us the slip once before and failed, Frodo," he said. "This time you have nearly succeeded, but you have failed again. It was not Sam, though, that gave you away this time, but Gandalf himself." "Yes," said Gandalf. "For it will be better to ride back 3 together than 1 alone. Well, here at last, dear friends, on the shores of the sea, comes the end of our fellowship in Middle-earth. Go in peace. I will not say, do not weep, for not all tears are an evil." Then Frodo kissed Merry and Pippin, and last of all Sam, and went aboard. And the sails were drawn up, and the wind blew, and slowly the ship slipped away down the long grey firth, and the light of the glass of Galadriel that Frodo bore glimmered and was lost. And the ship went out into the high sea, and passed on into the west, until at last on a night of rain Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air, and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And then it seemed to him that as in his dream in the house of Bombadil, the grey rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. But to Sam the evening deepened to darkness as he stood at the haven. And as he looked at the grey sea, he saw only a shadow on the waters that was soon lost in the west. There still he stood far into the night, hearing only the sigh and murmur of the waves on the shores of Middle-earth, and the sound of them sank deep into his heart. Beside him stood Merry and Pippin, and they were silent. At last the three companions turned away, and never again looking back, they rode slowly homewards, and they spoke no word to one another until they came back to the Shire, but each had great comfort in his friends on the long grey road. At last they rode over the downs and took the east road, and then Merry and Pippin rode on to Buckland, and already they were singing again as they went. But Sam turned to Bywater, and so came back up the hill, as day was ending once more. And he went on, and there was yellow light and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said.
That's it. Father Andrew and I are sailing away with Galadriel, and Father Anthony, the Shire is in your hands.
I think, Father, that was the bit that Steve read on the very first episode as well, if I'm not mistaken.
No kidding.
That could be the case. I
That'd
was
be
hearing
awesome.
his voice. I was hearing his voice once or twice.
I
The
remember
voice of Steve.
that well, I'm back, and hearing him talk about that, that feeling of being expected, of having a place to belong.
You know,
Yeah.
one of the things that struck me in this, I don't know how many times now I've read that passage, but one of the things that struck me this time was, I don't know, I never noticed before that Sam stands there on the shore for a long time afterwards.
Yeah.
And Merry and Pippin just standing there with him in silence.
Yeah.
It's a very cinematic moment. Yeah. I love the fact that that Tolkien himself gives us, the reader, time to weep over the story that is now over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
people have sometimes complained about how long it takes The Lord of the Rings to end, but I think for a work of the scope, it's just the only way that you could do it. There's a Welsh word, which Tolkien certainly knew, and I think this is an association he would have appreciated. Hiraeth, which means something like deep longing, wistfulness, nostalgia. And a lot of times when we use the word like nostalgia, it's kind of a pejorative. But the fact is that Tolkien does create within you this kind of deep longing that by the time you get to the end of the story, you know it has to end. You know it's supposed to end. And yet there's a little part of you that is just there with Sam looking out, crying a little, weeping a little. And then you come back home and you're like, all right, well, now I have to get on with my life, right? Now life has to go on.
Yeah. I'll say the obvious. I feel that way about this podcast.
Sure, yeah.
When I presented to Richard the idea of doing the Great Tales, I also added into it, because in the back of my head I thought, well, number one, like I can't just keep adding things. But I think I said something like, hey, we should do this thing, but it would be a lot if we were doing these two shows that are so big. And that was the point when Richard said, well, of course we're going to have to wrap up Amon Sûl.
Yeah.
And it was kind of, Richard, you sort of gave me permission to go ahead and grieve for our end of the podcast. And I don't know if we've said this before, but I mean, the plan was to really that this would be the last episode, period. That 11D1 would be it. And that Amon Sûl would be over. But when, the whispers quietly got out, even before anything was announced, that this was going to be the end. That's when you, Father Anthony, you said, "Can I have it?"
No.
And I immediately was like, oh yeah, that's the right thing to happen.
Right, right. So, I think the idea that we're sailing off into the west, and Father, you're the Sam that gets to have care of the Shire. It's been saved, but not for us. You know, I think that's obviously that doesn't completely apply because God willing, we'll come back. But um,
Keeping the place warm for you.
thank you. Yes.
You
Yeah,
will
this
always
is
be expected, and there will always be a warm fire for you. Anytime you want to come back and actually say, "Well, I'm back."
yeah. This has been this has been one of my favorite things to do in my life.
Mm.
In my life. Um,
And I would like to mention that it's still our intent to be very closely involved with Doxamut,
oh yes.
which is the associated conference, annual Orthodox Tolkien conference. Um, Currently the only one. I'm trying to work on getting ours started back up in the Dallas area, maybe this next year. But yeah, it's always a really wonderful and beautiful time, and I'm hoping that that will be an opportunity for all of us who love this stuff to get together in person, next year. So we
Labor Day
already have
weekend.
Labor Day weekend 2025. So just go ahead and block it off on your
Mark it
calendar
off.
now, guys, and everybody come out.
In the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. Yep. Yep.
Yep.
It's going to be beautiful. So, anyway, thank you both for all of your work, for all of your example, and for your kindness in allowing it to go on. I'm looking forward to the coming months and years, and whatever God gives us to enjoy this together. All right. With that, we come to the little segment that Father Andrew, you like to call "They're Taking the Hobbits to Isengard."
Oh boy.
A segment that I have much neglected in recent years. But once in a while, still we can always bring it back.
That's right. So
Now, can we count my performance during the 2 trivia contests that we did at Doxamut this last year? Can we just count that towards the segment?
no, I
Dang it.
stayed up too late last night finding
Oh gosh.
train benders for you.
Oh
So
boy. All right.
so this
Okay.
is the time when you get to play for absolutely no prizes except, well, the chance to possibly do it again the next time you come as a guest. A little game that will test whether you are, in fact, true Tolkien fans that everyone should have been listening to, or if you've been wasting everyone's time for the last 5 years. So, our category for today for our podcast's founders is appropriate to the occasion. We're going to talk about passing things on to other people. Since there are two of you, you each get 3 questions. Father Andrew will go first, and then Richard, and we'll continue in alternation.
Are we competing against each other?
You can,
man.
whoever loses the most, gets fed to the Urukai, and the other one gets to, crawl away into the woods. Or you can stay together. So we're going to do this a little bit differently. Instead of multiple choice questions, we're playing by Cook family house rules.
Oh no.
So the game is this. I will read a quote from Tolkien's works, and you have to tell me who the speaker was.
Okay.
Bonus points if you can give the context as well. And the
Okay.
rules, for my part, to keep it fair, are these. This will be an actual quotation by a named character. No narrator gotchas and no, no pieces just from the text.
Footnotes.
Yeah. No footnotes. 2, it will be a full sentence or a sentence fragment if that's all that is quoted. And then 3, it will only be taken from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
Since this is a new format, I'll give you an example so you can see what sort of skullduggery you can expect. The first time my dad played this with me, the quote he gave me was, "There let it lie until the end." So I eventually remembered, or I think he had to give it away to me, that Saruman says this within the
Yes.
legendarium, but the speaker in the books is actually Gandalf quoting Saruman at the
Yes.
Council of Elrond.
That would have gotten me. I would have been like, Saruman said that.
So let the player beware.
Oh
Okay.
man.
Round one, Father Andrew, who said, I have given you a present already, more than I could afford?
Oh, I've given you a present already, more than I could afford. Oh,
Richard wants to answer.
Meh, 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 meh. Hitting the buzzer here.
I
Okay, this is
No, no,
this
no,
is
no, 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 no.
oh,
Father
dang
Andrew
it.
has to do it. This is Father Andrew's question. Nope.
um oh man, I absolutely know this, but I don't know it. Um oh, it's Deagle.
There we go.
Although he's the speaker, right? But it's Gandalf telling the story.
There we
Yes.
go. There
Yes.
we go. Very nice. And the
Yes.
fuller context is Gandalf saying, "Give us that Deagle, my love," said Smeagol over his friend's shoulder. "Why?" said Deagle. "Because it's my birthday, my love, and I want it," said Smeagol. "I don't care," said Deagle. "I have given you a present already, more than I could afford. I found this, and I'm going to keep it,"
Yes, yes.
followed by unpleasantness.
I really want to know, by the way, like what present did he give him that he couldn't afford? Assuming I assume that
Right.
these little pre-hobbits like don't have currency. So like anyway.
Maybe it was
All right.
a hen, so he could get all the eggs that he wanted.
Yeah, that's a
Egg sucking.
good
All
idea.
right, Richard, your turn.
Okay.
Who said, "So I thought perhaps you would care to have this, don't you know?"
He's just frozen
Oh,
with
jeez. Why'd you give me the hard one? Um,
because we know that you're the greater nerd.
So
so I thought,
it's a gesture of respect, not at all vengeance for the way you pulled out.
yeah, okay. I see how it is. So give it to me one more time. I'm sorry.
So, so I thought perhaps you would care to have this, don't you know? Now, the fun thing about this is I can read it in a way that is
Yep.
purposely like
Right.
misleading you.
Wow.
Jeez, this is
I can't think of this myself, actually.
The face Richard is making is why this needs to be on
Yeah.
YouTube.
Oh yeah, and
So
a lot of listeners right now are like shouting out the answer because of course.
yeah. So perhaps man, I feel like this is something that happens in Minas Tirith when Frodo is convalescing and we're talking about pipeweed. Maybe I've just got that scene on the brain. I'm gonna say, oh jeez. Is it you would prefer to have this or you'd like to have this? I'm sorry.
Should
Uh,
have,
I
isn't it?
thought perhaps you would care to have
Would
this.
care to have this.
Should have this.
Um, you know what? I'm gonna say it's Sam. Sounds like a thing Sam would say.
Good guess, but wrong.
Ah, dang it.
Oh,
Here's the context. "Here is your sword," he said, "but
Gosh darn
it
it.
was broken, you know. I took
Yeah.
it to keep it safe, but I've forgotten to ask if the smiths could mend it. No time now. So I thought perhaps you would care
Pippin.
to have this, don't you know?" You know
Is
where we are now?
is Pippin?
No. He took from the box a small sword in an old shabby leathern scabbard. And he
So
drew it,
I'm sorry.
the
I'm sorry.
polished
Yeah.
and well-tended blade
ding.
glittered
The gift of
There's
suddenly.
sting.
two different hobbits who break their swords trying to stab Nazgul, and we always remember the one that was successful and not so much Frodo. Yeah. Okay. All right. Gosh
So
darn it.
this is Bilbo.
Bilbo and
Yeah, and
Rivendell. Yeah,
Rivendell
This
giving
yeah.
is Sting.
That was actually I had that thought kind of float through, and then I was like, no, it sounds like Sam, and so I just went with Sam.
Fair
Anyway.
enough.
Okay.
All right. So those were sort of the
Oh,
easy ones, although
oh
the
gosh.
we get Richard might be easier. So,
Okay.
Father
All
Andrew,
right.
here's your next question.
Okay.
Said, "Now it comes to it, I don't like parting with it at all, I may say."
Oh, that's Bilbo speaking to Gandalf.
There we go.
That he doesn't want to give up the ring. I do feel like you're giving me easier
What
questions
the heck,
than
Father
Richard,
Anthony?
but
Well, you know.
but I'm happy to be ahead. I mean, it's just how the chips fall, So.
All right.
Well, let's see if I can make it harder the next time. So yes, Bilbo Gandalf looked again very hard at Bilbo. There was a gleam in his eyes. I think, Bilbo, he
Now
said,
it
quote,
comes to it.
I should leave it behind. Don't you want to? Well, yes, and now it comes to it. I don't like parting with it at all, I may say. And I don't really see why I should. Why do you want me to? So,
Yeah. I mean, that line,
right.
especially now that it comes to it, is delivered so brilliantly by Ian Holm
Yeah.
in
Great Bilbo.
yeah, this
Yeah.
very covetous kind of
Yeah.
tone in his voice,
Ian Holm was just brilliant. I was
So
so
good.
glad that he was able to play that role. All right, Richard. Now it's your turn again, and this really is looking like the revenge of the Father Anthony. So
Wow.
he said it was found in his chest.
Oh,
You might actually get this.
Gandalf said that.
No,
No?
no. You want another guess?
Then I don't know. I would assume this is a
Okay,
reference to stuff found in Orthanc,
I'll
but
give you the context.
yeah.
Hama knelt and presented to Theoden
Oh yeah.
the
Gosh
scabbard,
darn
clasped with
it.
That was
gold,
the
Gosh
green
darn it.
gems.
yeah.
Dear Lord is Heru Grim, your ancient blade. It was found in his chest. Loth he was to render up the keys. Many other
Yes.
things are there, which
Yeah,
meant
Too
yeah.
bad it wasn't found in his
Just
chest.
like literally what no, I knew I was thinking of the stuff that Saruman had hoarded in Orthanc that was later found, not the
right.
stuff that Grima,
That
Saruman's buddy.
doesn't show up until
You're
he
right, you're right, you're right. That's
would have
right.
broken the rules.
Yep. Okay. All right. Okay.
All right, round three. Father Andrew, you've already, survived because you just had to get 2 out of 3. But
True.
let's see if you can.
It's okay. This one is for all the points at the
Here we
end.
go.
Right. You're gonna give me
So, your last question. Who said, in that task you shall have all the aid that you are pleased to ask for?
In that task, you shall have all the aid that you are pleased to ask for. Is it I'm gonna guess it's Elrond speaking to Frodo.
Oh, nope, you're wrong. Good guess, though. Full context. The actual context is, yet the Lord of Gondor is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy,
right.
and to him there is no purpose higher in the world as it now stands than the good of Gondor, and the rule of Gondor, my lord, is mine and no other man's, unless the king should come again. Unless the king should come again, said Gandalf. Well, my lord steward, it is your task to keep some kingdom still against that event, which few now look to see. In that task, you shall have all the aid that you are pleased to ask for.
My gosh, I can't. I just
I didn't realize I did like a double revenge against you here, Richard, because I
this
gave
is so
Father Andrew
brutal.
all the ones you could have gotten. I'm very pleased. All right, Richard, to see if you can, save.
Okay.
Life
All right.
isn't fair.
Some kind of
Richard.
dignity. Let's go.
Life is not fair.
All right. Who said, we boast seldom and then perform or die in the attempt?
I feel like we should have Orc singing the girl from Ipanema as we're, waiting for
Oh man, we boast seldom.
the girl from Ipanema is the single most popularly used elevator music in American film.
I think
Seriously.
everybody,
Oh
knows.
yeah.
It seems obvious to me.
I was telling one of my kids about that the other day, and she's like, I've never heard music in an elevator. I was like, oh man, I feel old.
Oh,
Man, I don't know. I'm gonna say it's Faramir.
you get it by accident. I'll tell you what
It sounds like something Faramir would say when he's
Yeah.
contrasting Rohirric and Gondorian culture.
What's better than that? Because the next line is not if I found it on the highway.
Yeah.
So
I
I'll
got
read the
you.
full context.
Yeah.
Alas, for Boromir, it was too sore a trial, he said. How you have
Wow.
increased my sorrow, you two strange wanderers from our country, bearing the peril of men. But you are less judges of men than I of halflings. We are truth speakers, we men of Gondor. We
We
boast
both
seldom,
seldom.
and then
Yeah.
perform or die in the attempt.
Yep.
Not if I found it on the highway would I take it, I said. Even if I were such a man as to desire this thing, and even though I knew not clearly what this thing was when I spoke, still I should take those words as a vow and be held by them.
Yeah.
So
well, 1 out of 3.
That's right.
Recognizing the tone, you got it.
Yeah, yeah. It sounded like something Faramir would say. He says a lot of things that are in that tone.
Yeah.
So,
Father Andrew, you have survived the Urukai one last time until you come again. Richard, vengeance is sweet.
Oh,
I guess you didn't need your legs anymore.
yep.
Good luck in Isengard.
they're taking the Roland to Isengard.
There we go. All righty. And that's all we've got for today. Thank you, Father Andrew and Richard, for creating this podcast and shepherding this community for 5 years. You've built something beautiful. I'm honored to carry it forward. Please know you are welcome back anytime.
And thank you, Father, for taking this thing we love so much and carrying it forward.
Vengeance will be long, but sure in coming.
Wow.
No.
No, you're going to do something terrible to me if you ever bring me on.
I'll begin planning now. No, thank you so much for doing this. I can't wait to listen to what you do with the show. One of my great memories of Father Anthony was during COVID, whoever has HarperCollins or whoever basically made it, basically gave permission for people to read the books online. And so, Father Anthony, I think you did The Hobbit, right?
I did the whole Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it was the Lord of the Rings. Okay. And it was so I listened to that for several days. Amazingly, even my father-in-law, who's not Orthodox, he found those recordings and listened to them, and he used to talk to me about how much he loved your voice and everything. I was like, wait a minute, I know that person. But anyway,
you're misremembering the story, actually, because what he found was me reading the Ballad of the White Horse, which is what I started doing. And when I ran out of Chesterton, then I started reading The Hobbit.
My father-in-law found you reading the Ballad of the White Horse?
Or maybe you shared it and he got
Yeah,
it.
that's what. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Anyway, it's been a long time now, but I really enjoyed your voice and certainly the conversations that we had, your insight. So I think this is going to be really great. I hope people just tune in. We're not, things are just getting bigger. It's one of those things where we're part of the same podcast after all.
Oh, dear. Those are fighting words to end with. All right. Well, next time on Amon Sûl, I will be joined by Dr. Brad Berzer, a very old friend of mine and a friend of the podcast, and we'll be talking about the story proper as it begins with a long expected party. So I'm looking forward to that. Meantime, you can send your questions, comments, topics, suggestions, or orcish ideas for our next guests on their Taking the Hobbits to Isengard to me at amonsul@ancientfaith.com or by messaging us through the podcast Facebook page.
And if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe to the Amon Sûl podcast on your favorite podcast app. And please rate and review and look up the Amon Sûl podcast on Facebook. Click the follow button. And most of all, share it with your friends.
While you're at it, if you appreciate this or other Ancient Faith media, please go to ancientfaith.com/support and show us some practical love.
We have been around since 2019. You can find the full back catalog of episodes by going to tolkienpodcast.com. I still can't believe you got that URL. Or you can just subscribe on your podcast app.
The Amon Sûl podcast theme music is Hidden Past, and the closing theme is Celtic Impulse, and they're both by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find his music at incompetech.com.
Our podcast cover art was created by Samuel Hebel. Our audio producer / Eriador cartographer is Charlotte Martin, and our video editor / volatile herb lore consultant is Simon Nelson.
And special thanks go to the Amon Sûl Facebook group for conversation, inspiration, and the occasional coup to seize control of the podcast and exile its founders, to enter. I am your new host, Father Anthony Cook, and even though Bobby Maddox will now wonder how anyone ever convinced Father Andrew to give up his precious, this has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.